Alright, so this post, Dharana and Dhyana in depth. I said, I had to take a somewhat short break the last few days to continue an inner working more completely on the outer, which involved much work, meetings, and travel. For the most part, I have been a solitary adept with only a few contacts I find worthy of working with in any deeper way. And even then, they happen to be located far away. This is all well enough, though, and from the looks of it, this publication is already doing its job of spreading the 999 current around the planet, i.e. the fusion of the 93 Horus current and that of the 696 Ma'at, with that of 210, the gnosis of the key of it all, as has been presented earlier in this publication. Also the whole unto nuit formula. As readers will have known, this is the revived gnosis of Therion, which is 999 using non-final 700, which was prophesied in Liber AL to be revealed by another prophet. This gnosis is only secret or occult to those who fail to understand. In this whole post 76, I was discussing 76 with someone in there's something about the whole spirit of 76 and the whole magical current, if you will, of the United States, because 17 plus 76 is 93, and USA is 67, Bina, and just 76 being the reflection. There's a lot, I forgot all the different things, but maybe they'll come up. But there is a lot to even, this whole idea of what the United States was about with, just freedom of speech and all this other stuff. And it was sort of a new eon in itself, or at least the beginning. And yet this is obviously way back with the Bavarian Illuminati. But in a sense, it was I don't know, a parallel. And so there definitely is something to 666 as being positive as well as negative. It's weird, especially being the magnetic energy center. It implies the polarization of that. But anyway, so after reading chapter 5, we proceeded to the next Liber, which was Liber E Vel Itsaiciorum, subfigure 9. Crowley says that this book instructs the aspirant in the necessity of keeping a record, suggests methods of testing physical clairvoyance, gives instructions in asana, pranayama, and dharana, and advises the application of tests to the physical body, in order that the student may thoroughly understand his own limitations. Crowley's emphasis on the magical record is crucial. Though I call this publication my magical record, it is really the drawing board in which I lay out for others what I've already come to experience and analyze in my real magical records, along with a basic magical record in which every possible detail is recorded. One should also maintain a separate dream record. Skipping over the next chapter of Liber Abba, Book 4, I went ahead to the next two Libers since they are relatively short and deal in part with some of the concepts currently talked about in ABA or Abba and the lectures. Crowley says of Liber Portalucius, subfigure 10, this book is an account of the sending forth of the Master Therion by the AA and an explanation of his mission. And Portalucius, the Gate of Light, is one of the titles of Malkuth, whose number is 10. The next Liber is Liber Nu, subfigura 11, which is Crowley's instruction for attaining Nuit. Yesterday I was finally able to get back to reading and editing. Chapter 6 is about Dhyana and the differences between it and Samadhi, which is what the next chapter will be about. Note that Dhyana has a value of 71, which is also that of the union between A, 1, and O, 70. The A-O, or alpha omega, or I-O binary sequence also forms the soul symbol. And remember what Crowley says about Dhyana as also being called the sun. In this glyph, the subject, one, and the object, O, are united via the discipline of Dharana. Adding the concentration of Dharana 262 to the result of Dhyana gives the value of 333, which is that of the occult knowledge, or Kabbalah knowledge, of Silba. The term Kenneth Grant uses in Outer Gateways to symbolize the true stellar self beyond the lower self. And stellar man is 666, as opposed to like the automaton and all the other sort of lower forms of. In Liber AL 55, Chapter 2, it is said, "Thou shalt obtain the order and value of the English alphabet. Thou shalt find new symbols to attribute them unto." The new symbols are really just the old Hebrew letter values applied to English, which, when applied to Liber El Vel Legis itself, shows that the original title, before Frater Akkad mentioned his key of Akkad, or one, has the same value as the beast 666, as well as the AL cryptogram and the value of Liber AL, Chapter 2, 76. The secret Liber AL code, which no one has hitherto discovered apparently, as can be seen if you do any searches on this material, or if you ask any adepts of the OTO or Outer College of AA, they will tell you that gematria is merely mental masturbation and are themselves too illiterate in the Kabbalah and Crowley's work itself sometimes to understand. And I say that just because they really do write off gematria, and like, because it is, a lot of people do bastardize it and just don't really again, keep a database or a record and then just see what logically would fall into place based on contextual events and stuff. So thus these orders are defunct and will bar themselves from future progress until they catch up, for these keys unlock further gnosis necessary to advancement. The revival and updating of this gnosis is being effected now through the formula of 999. And that's because there's this further overarching sort of alignment that all these other Kabbalah, chamber numbers, kind of synchronize with. I don't know how else to explain it, but when you start seeing the databases, each of the numbers contain, and then the contextual development, the historical development, you can actually start seeing actual things. It's essentially like illustrations, even though it's data, but it starts becoming more and more obvious, I guess. But so I was going to go into what I've kind of learned about all this. Vok is another name of the goddess, and it's funny because it's 15, and so is Dev, the root of Deva, Devi, Devanagari, etc. Veda, but also the Veda is a 76, and so is Vedanta. And so what I found, I hadn't really heard of it, but Dhvani, which is essentially D, which is thought, mind, meditation, intellect, added to Vani, which is essentially similar to Vok and Vani, speech, and kind of reminds me of Varna, but Dhvani is essentially intellectual speech, and so it's literally in a way poetry. And so the ability to sort of wrap meaning up in language or words, which there's a lot, it's very deep. That's why I pulled up all these different things, because the Hindu sort of philosophy of Dhvani, which is what I had found as another way of considering this whole thing. The Hindu again being 75, philosophy is 420 of Dhvani, or Hindu philosophy of the Vedas, or the Hindu philosophy of Vedanta, it would be 666. And essentially it's again the parsing of letters, or not just letters, but in a way it's like using the Om itself, the supreme syllable, and being able to poetically, which again, poet is 555, 111 is many things, but the japa is another form of sort of mantras, and it's not necessarily actual like a mantra is generally verbal, but again they have different forms of them, which brings up this whole book by Lama Anagarika Govinda, who wrote Foundations of Tibetan Mysticism, which kind of goes into the same thing, but I found this book a little more just to the point. And it's, I mean, the title itself, Creative Meditation in Multi-Dimensional Consciousness. He essentially says that this whole thing about mantras or bija mantras, they're better thought of as multidimensional, essentially. So multidimensionality of seed syllables, bija, and but anyway, the japa. There's other ways of putting it, because also bija vapa. So yeah, bija vapa, which is to like sow a seed, is also 111. But Dhvani, so I need to go back to this. Dhvani, so I should go back to all this. Dhvani is kind of interesting because it also brings up this other book, which I'm going to bring up all these books right here, but Sonic Theology by Guy Beck. And I mean, it goes into the different aspects of like Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva, and even Shakti as sound, essentially. The Sri Vidya aspect of it. And it's a pretty profound thing, but I'm not gonna, technically I'd recommend actually getting the physical book. It was hard to find this PDF, but the physical book is like that thick, but it's still worth it. But I'm just bringing this up because there's one section I want to pull up. It's right at the end, which he says, conclusion, even mentions Madame Blavatsky, or Blavatsky, whatever. But it brings into whole like perspective this whole thing about the word and like Masonry and the Adamic language, and you know, I mean, it's a pretty deep subject, and I don't want to read this whole thing right now because I wanted to keep this short. But this book essentially goes into why this whole idea is so universal and profound. But then this book, this Photo Theory of Language, is also very good. It goes into, it reminds me of General Semantics of Alfred Korzybski, but just Indian, like Hindu or Indian. And I would recommend this book to better understand all this. Sphota means to like spurt, but also like it implies this sort of binding, and then like it's like how language has a sort of there's a vacuum, which Vok relates to, but a sort of springing into, I don't know, it's hard to explain. I think that's why it talks about like there's this process that's very deep in the brain, and it goes back to this whole idea of like subvocal speech and all that. And but Svota, Shabda kind of gets complicated, but yet interesting. There's Sunya, Purusha, and Shabda, Brahman, but another way of putting it would be Sunya, Brahman, and Shabda, Purusha. Wait. Shabda. So, Shabda, Purusha. So Shabda, Purusha, like the sound of this spiritual sound, and also the Sunya, Brahman, which is Brahman is associated with Sunya. But there's other ways of considering that, because like Vishnu or Manjusri is both 377, and then 289 is so many things relating to like the Furba, lightning bolt, Dorje, Furba. I know it's 17 times 17, and 17 is Zayin. So there's just some weird Kabbalistic like overlap with some of this stuff, but it helps understand what is. I mean, there's actually something even deeper than obviously just 666, because what I found is, which I shouldn't jump ahead, but relating to this whole idea of like Malkuth as X, and what Crowley talks about as dimension X. I've called it the fourth dimensional cube before. 666, fourth dimensional cube, or well, cube with a gimel for C, Aleph, Beth, gimel. But you can also think of it as a torus plus a hypercube. And a torus hypercube implies the sort of hyperdimensional sphere and the hyperdimensional cube together, which is what 666 kind of represents. And drawing it out, you could put it like overlay a torus conceptually over a hypercube, and that's sort of a better mathematic, like a better model for the fourth dimensional cube, and space-time essentially itself. And essentially there's so many different things that I've realized about all this, but also Jagannatha, which is also related to again Sunya Brahma or Sunya Brahman. Jagannatha, I've known about it, but I just avoided it for some reason. But he is the Lord of the universe. I know he means also, like, his name means Juggernaut, or Juggernaut comes from that. But another name for him apparently is Kittung, which is 107, or Kitting, which shows again that connection between 107, this sort of Akasha, and XYZ, which I had saw it as a sort of smiling face underlying like in space back whenever I around the time of the video called the secret language of the soul or whatever. And 107 again being Ananda, it's he is a form of Krishna, but also the whole Trinity from what I've seen. And what else was I going to say about Jagannatha? Well, oh yeah, Jagannatha is another spelling. Jagannatha is 76, so that's timely. But then Achalanatha is 107, and that's essentially Manjushri and etc. So there is this definite overlap in all that. Also vacuum is 67, and so again it's like the reverse of that, it's there's definitely something to this whole idea of the Shabda Brahman, Shabda Purusha Sanya Brahman. So yeah, there's definitely this so, and also 76, I realized like the 6 is like the cube, 70 is the circle, which hyperdimensionally as the eye is the sort of torus. So 76 is sort of like, I mean, being the 70, which is that circle of, I don't know, 76, it just reminds me of that, it makes me think of that, like a beehive in a sense. The hexagonal lattice. But yeah, quantum is 212. I'm fucked up. Quantum is 212. Hyperspace made 666. So quantum hyperspace again of the torus hypercube, or the hypercube torus, however you want to put that. Quantum spaces. There's just a lot to that whole thing, and essentially the mythological space of humanity, a phrase that I realized like from this whole thing about that whole myth and cult of the goddess book, or whatever it's called, and Mircea Eliade, and this sort of cyclical, what he calls the eternal return. There definitely is this hyperdimensional sort of geometry that I think is being like it's like a blind spot essentially, I think. But that's what this whole book, Creative Meditation, is kind of refers to as this inward dimension, which also, again, Persephone and the Ancient Secret kind of also hint towards or lead to. So yeah, just this, there's something literally starting to develop out of these codes, at least in my notebooks, it's starting to become very illustrated. But yeah, just this realization that Jagannatha is probably what I had come to realize, and I'd already associated with 107. But where he's called Kittung, or Kittung, right here, according to Dina Krishna Joshi, the word may have its origins in the tribal word Kittung. So, I don't know, and he's related to there's another form of him related to Narasimha. And I don't know, like I need to read more about him all, but read more all about him. But anyway, this whole thing is starting, like, I don't know how else I can really describe it. I've had to sit here and like wonder what the hell is 76 gonna bring, but the Nama or Nam is also 111. So like the Japa, the Nama, but then Nam Jap, the communal recitation of Nam. This is sort of the Sikh version of a similar concept, essentially. I remember in The Science of the Soul, this book I'd found, in the title of that is 666. It mentions a lot about Nam and Nama. Essentially, it's the same thing. But this whole Japa Mala is similar. It's like what's on this cover of this book, The Doctrine of Vibration. In this book is, like not really about as much about the actual sound theory as it is Shaivism itself. But it's also kind of important because it gives a lot more context and background to the whole subject, and it shows how they've known about it for quite some time. And these books came up, and I think there's something to this as well, because his whole theory, Eric Havelock, which he was also kind of interested in, or like bumped elbows with, what's his name, Marshall McLuhan, and just the importance of poetry and like shaping history in a sense. He's sort of critical about that. Poetry as preserved communication. There's other ways of sort of conveying information, I think, and it's just interesting how definitely there is some sort of like data transmission happening. And I think people sometimes, like, this guy's a little critical about it, but I think you can find, like, you can sort of, with gematria, for example, you can like decode things, and so knowledge won't necessarily be lost, which is the theory, like what this guy says here essentially. So he says, like, total reabsorption of all forms of discourse into a single word, of all books into a single page, of the whole world into one book. Likewise, sonic theology, in terms of the death of God question, holds promise. What is signified by this death is not the impossibility of the theological quest, but its relocation. The angle of theological vision is now toward the forgotten and archaic, toward the word as aboriginal schema, as pre-utterance. Thus, the future of hermeneutics requires the task of being thoroughly in touch or in tune with the complexities of the sonic realm. So, Hindu India, is that legitimized by the Veda, and Agama is also a soundscape, an immense auditorium of sonic manifestations backed by centuries of theoretical formulation. Inversely, there are very few soundproof corners in the Hindu topography. The numerous Hindu temples that dot the landscape are not silent monoliths, but rather house-living deities who require soundful worship on a regular schedule. So yeah, there's a lot to this whole thing, but he mentions the Godhead, which is also 111. But where was it? He said essentially that, yeah, like, this whole thing, knowledge won't necessarily be lost if you have the keys. The point is made, however, that what is essential is not what is physically pronounced, but what these sounds are taken as representing in terms of the phonological structure of our language. So again, this whole idea of Dhvani and parsing, essentially this supreme syllable or sound or just the air. And again, air in Greek would be alpha, iota, rho. And so the power of this partitioning air is important, because essentially, like, that's one way of mechanically moving, not just air, but you could move things. So and whether it be air or steam or whatever, it's like an engine. And so I know that's a little occult, but as far as how to better explain that, but yeah, it says various occult traditions in the West have labored to uncover the essential word or mystical language by which to pierce an alleged veil of secrecy. Their general point of outlook has been noted by George Steiner. The image of the world as a concatenation of secret syllables. And so again, secret bija mantras. The notion of an absolute idiom or cosmic letter, alpha and aleph, which underlies the rent, so alpha and aleph, again, aleph being 111, which underlies the rent fabric of human tongues, the supposition that the entirety of knowledge is prefigured in a final tome containing all conceivable permutations of the alphabet. So again, mentions like the tradition of Freemasonry, for example, continually seeks to recover the lost word. And again, the Greek word for the word, ha lexi or eta lexi, is the word. And also Ania, and again air, so the partitions of the air in a way, and air is also spirit, breath, mind. So again, this Om, which again, another form of Om, is also 111. But I could go on and like try to explain this. It's just interesting to find this in this book, which again, I'd recommend this whole book. Like, it's very important. The Chandogya Upanishad comes, like, is very, like, even more profound after contemplating all this. But again, so yeah, Vak can also be with a K, 27, and 27 is kind of universal. But there's, I'm sure, all sorts of ways of parsing it and looking at it. It's just certain things for me, like when you can look at the sort of database and see things, or not even just look at the database, but know from your own, like just familiarity. But this book is also like, I mean, it's a very dense book going through these different philosophers' views of justice and whatnot. But the title itself, the Greek concept of justice, just to sort of like mention it. Oops. The Greek concept of justice, again, Hebrew applied to English, it's just what it is. Not everything is that, though. It's not like I can't make like Odysseus equal that, probably. Oh wait, it's close, because if there was a T, it could be, but there's no T. But Odysseus, Empyrean, I don't know. I mean, you can find stuff like just checking, but when certain titles, like I found numerous titles of books equal either, like, not just that, but other things, like book 4. It's just kind of interesting. But yeah, this book I need to like go more into. There's a lot to it, obviously. Then there's also this Cassirer book that was mentioned also in that, like, Myth, Cult, and Symbols in Shakta Hinduism. That book mentions the philosophy of symbolic forms, which I apparently had already, the first volume on language and paperback, which I didn't even realize, like, I don't know, I had it for a while. But he goes also into just this profundity of language and its connection to form. Which I think is it's an untapped resource, because again, there's still so many profound things that I found regarding this stuff, but yet it's like all disconnected and compartmentalized. But real quick, I'm going to read this because it's interesting. It says multidimensionality of seed syllables, or bija. It is significant that the main mantric seed syllables, bija, of the Vajrayana, and in particular those used in the basic structure of the mandala of the Dhyani Buddhas, are based on simple vowel sounds like O, A, U, I, corresponding to 4 movements: the circular, all-inclusive, the horizontal, the downward, and the upward movement. The upward and downward movements of Hri and Hum also correspond to the movements of the respective elements with which they are associated in the mandala. Fire moves upward, water downward. Earth and air associated with the bijas Tram and Ah stretch out horizontally. Just as water and fire are opposites in movement, so Akshobhya and Amitabha stand opposite each other in the mandala. But their polarity, i.e. their compensatory nature, is indicated by the fact that they belong to the same axis in the diagram upon which the mandala is constructed. Their common factor is that both represent introspective attitudes, Their difference consists in the fact that Akshobhya's attitude is mainly a reflective and receptive awareness, while Amitabha's attitude is that of discerning or distinguishing vision, i.e. active and creative. Their corresponding mudras show the same tendency. Akshobhya's reflective attitude is expressed by the inward-turned palm of his right hand, Amitabha's distinguishing vision by the upward-turned palm of his right hand. Thus, the vertical east-west axis of the mandala may be called the axis of introspective knowledge, or prajna. In contrast to this, the horizontal north-south axis may be called the outwardly directed axis of compassionate involvement. Just as earth and air are opposites in density and movability, so Ratnasambhava and Amogha Siddhi are the polar opposites in the horizontal axis of the mandala. Ratnasambhava represents feeling and emotion, while Amogha Siddhi represents volition and action. Both are extrovertive or communicative, i.e. directed toward other beings, either in the feeling of love and compassion, or in the selfless action motivated by these feelings. This outward directedness and communication is expressed in the mudras of both Ratnasambhava and Amogha Siddhi, whose right-hand palms are turned outward. From all this, it becomes evident that the mandala reveals a double polarity. First, that of prajna and karuna, the axis of introspective knowledge, and the axis of compassionate involvement. And second, the inner polarity of each single axis, such as reflective awareness and creative vision of the east-west axis, or feeling and action or emotion and volition of the north-south axis. But a mandala is not merely a static structure of the mind. It represents the inner space in which we move. And our movement here again reveals a third kind of polarity insofar as we are alternating between inward and outward directed states or mental attitudes. And so again, this whole idea of a torus hypercube can be thought of as, again, like the hypercube implies an inner and an outer, and the torus implies the inner and the outer, but also this moving, dynamic, you could say fractal, but a manifold sort of mechanism, it seems like. Again, the hyperdimension, like 666 in the 999 with the 333. Again, that sounds weird, but the 333 in so many ways represents this manifold thing about time, space-time, and in this sort of abstract way. And then 666 being a sort of cube in many ways, even the cube of the tarot, and so many, like, there's this Rubik's Cube sort of like, I don't know how to explain it, but this quantum spaces, that's what they essentially are. The dynamic relationship of the inner outer in this sort of material as well as spiritual, if you want to call it that, or inner and outer plane developmental process, if you want to call it that. I don't like the evolution, but is a good way to sum it up, because it's inner and outer. But in the clockwise movement, beginning from the eastern starting point, the meditator proceeds from the inward directed attitude of introspection, Akshobhya, to the outward directed attitude of communication, Ratnasambhava. In the third movement, he turns again inward in the attitude of meditative absorption, Amitabha. And in the fourth movement, again outward in action, Amogha Siddhi. This is indicated by the respective alternating mudras as mentioned before. However, the change in attitude does not mean a break in the continuity of the sadhana, or a negation of the previous experience. On the contrary, each experience forms the basis for the subsequent step and is thus integrated in the new attitude and experience. Without the wisdom of the great mirror, which reveals to us our true nature and our position in the world, we could not conceive the essential oneness of life and our solidarity with other sentient beings. And likewise, the wisdom of distinguishing vision is possible only on the basis of the essential unity of life, which enables us to see the interrelatedness of forms and individual beings. So again, the torus hypercube is a good way of considering the Huayan or the mandala of Huayan Buddhism. The underlying unity makes it possible to appreciate the value and the beauty of differentiation and the significance of individuality. Without it, unity would be meaningless and mutual understanding impossible. And again, it is on this basis of recognizing and understanding both individuality and the essential oneness of life that unselfish and spontaneous action can succeed in bringing happiness and liberation into the world. And so again, the 777 libertinos emanating from within the 666, or the 6 circles bringing about the 7th from within. 777 does have everything to do with this heart and the teaching of Kuan Yin, the mother and child essentially. Mother and child. Kuan Te-Yam. What is it? Kuan Te-Yam. So, that 76 kind of implies the 7, that higher dimensional 7 with the 6. So, the bijas proceed in a similar way. The Om is contained in the hum as it precedes every mantra, as for instance that of Akshobhya, Om Akshobhya Hum. And likewise, if we now proceed from Akshobhya to Ratnasambhava, the experience of hum and Om is included in the Tram, which both the experience of the hum and of the Tram are included in the Hri, and correspondingly all these bijas are present in the experience of Ah. When we now return to the hum of Akshobhya, we experience his mirror-like wisdom on a much higher level, a level that comes much nearer to that of the center. And in fact, if we arrive on the highest level of Akshobhya's wisdom, it no longer reflects merely the individual situation of the Sadhaka, but the universality of Vairocana's Dharmadhatu wisdom, which is now reflected in the Great Mirror. When this is the case, Akshobhya, under the name Vajrasattva Akshobhya, the diamond being, becomes identical with the center of the mandala. It is for this reason that Akshobhya and Vairochana become interchangeable. This relationship is clearly expressed by the colors associated with them. The body color of Akshobhya is blue. The radiation of the mirror-like wisdom emanating from his heart is white, like the reflection in the color of the element water. The body color of Vairocana is white, and the radiation of the Dharmadhatu wisdom emanating from his heart, i.e. from his essential being, is blue, like the color of the element ether. According to the emphasis upon the one or the other aspect of these Dhyani Buddhas, the triangular field on the eastern side of the mandala is either white or blue, in which case the circular space around Vairocana takes the opposite color, i.e. blue when Akshobhya's field is white, as in the case of our diagram of the basic mandala, and white when Akshobhya's field is blue. A deeper explanation can be found in the statement of the Vijnanavadins that Monovisionana, the empirical consciousness from which we start at the beginning of our meditation, and the universal consciousness are overlapping in what has been defined as manas, whose object is not the sense world, but that ever-flowing stream of becoming, santana. So again, it's making me think of the overlap of the cube and the circle, or the torus, the hypercube and the torus, as being a sort of I don't know how to explain it, two elemental streams, which is limited neither by birth and death nor by individual forms of appearance, but contains the sum total of all our but contains the sum total of all our past enshrined in the depth of our innermost being. It is the manifestation of the basic universal consciousness, or Alaya Vijnana. While the Monovisionana sorts out and judges the results of the 5 kinds of sense perceptions, the Alaya Vijnana has been compared to the ocean, on the surface of which waves and currents are formed when disturbed by outer influences, but which reflects the clear light of heaven when undisturbed by emotions, desires, or aversions, thus becoming the great mirror of Achyobhaya's wisdom. Mediating between the universal consciousness and the individual intellect is the spiritual consciousness, manas, which takes part in both sides. It represents the stabilizing element of the human mind, the central point of balance upholding the coherence of its contents by being the stable point of reference, magnetic energy center. But for the same reason, it can also be the cause for the conception of a permanent ego in the unenlightened individual who mistakes this relative point of reference for the real and permanent center of his own personality. Or, as the Lankavatara Sutra expresses it, intuitive mind, manas, is one with universal mind, Alaya Vijnana, by reason of its participation in transcendental intelligence, Arya Jnana, and is one with the mind system, the 5 senses in the intellect, by its comprehension of differentiated knowledge. Thus, it depends whether this intuitive mind is directed toward the world of differentiated sense impressions or toward the universal depth consciousness. In the first case, it reflects our momentary position in the present world. This is the situation with which we begin our meditation. In the latter case, it reflects our true universal nature and our identity with the Dharma Dhatu, at which we arrive after we have moved through the mandala many times in ever narrower circles, which finally emerge into the center. So that kind of brings a whole new outlook on 107 as Buddha land, and also the Akasha being 4, like the elements less, but also the Buddhas. I know there's 5, but they kind of come together in this overarching sort of 111. And Malkuth as the buoy, as Dion Fortune calls it, the buoy being also kind of like elemental, essentially. So this Dharma Dhatu, it's kind of, I don't know, I've been thinking about that, being Malkuth as the Dharma Dhatu. Since thus Achyobhaya is the reflection of Vairocana on the plane of human consciousness, the mantra hum represents the humanized experience of the Dharmakaya, the realization of the Dharmakaya in the human body, which thus becomes Nirmanakaya. Herein lies the special importance of hum, because it brings down the supramental upon the human plane, which is the aim of Buddhahood. Om is, so to say, the raw material, the universe in its pure suchness and objectivity, or the conditio sine qua non of all that is or appears in form. But the hum contains the experience of this suchness, plus that of all its modifications. It comprises both unity and diversity. Om may be compared to the purity of the child, in whom all possibilities of development are present in latent form, while hum is the return to the purity and simplicity of the child after a life of human experience, and with the knowledge and compassion that grow out of deep suffering and exalted joy. Is this the attitude of an enlightened one who has gone the way, who has arrived at the other shore, Param? Thus, the hum, in its highest potential, contains the Om and all other mantras of the Dhyani Buddhas. In those schools of the Vajrayana which follow the mystic or inner path of Vajrasattva, the adamantine being, which again, Adamas. And Adamas is another name for magnets, and Adamas magnets, 666, which there's so many different things about magnetism and 666, I won't even go into it right now, but metals, the active reflex or emanation of Akshobhya, in whom the rays of the combined wisdoms are integrated. Vajrasattva Akshobhya becomes the exponent of all transformed skandhas, integrated into the purified aggregate of consciousness, while Vairocana becomes the exponent of the purified aggregate of bodily form, i.e. the principle of spatial extension, or of space as the precondition of all bodily existence. In this case, the hum assumes a higher dimension than one that stood at the beginning of the meditative path. It is the integration of all the experiences and spiritual attitudes and wisdoms encountered in the process of the 4 movements around the center of the mandala. This may be summarized in the following formula. So, of hum, which is... This formula shows, as the name seed syllable bija indicates, that it is not a static but a growing thing which extends into ever higher dimensions through its steadily accumulating experiential content and spiritual as well as intellectual relations. So, yeah, there's like so much more to this. This guy, Lama Anagarika Govinda, really wrote some good books. But I think there's a lot to this whole thing, the Hindu philosophy of Dhvani. And even though I'm talking about Dharana and Dhyana, that's all like, just again, this is from it, what's been, I guess, quite a while. But just work and all sorts of other stuff. Just the fact that it takes a lot of, actual diligent patience and effort in actually trying to get these books physically, because it's a lot easier to read them, and just put it all into, again, like spatial and mental filing cabinets and organization and all that. But yeah, Jagannatha is really cool. I think that he looks a little like goofy, but if you can understand what he truly represents, like at the core, then you're good to go. I don't know. He's just really cool. Because Chalanatha. Essentially, all these different things show this like awakening from a higher level, and that's why I find it interesting. This stuff's sort of like baked in, not baked in, but it's just like, again, going back to this whole idea of Vishnu and just the incarnations, and like I found that past lives of Crowley. Oh wait, shit. Past lives of Crowley is 666, and again, I don't claim to be like a reincarnation of Crowley like so many people do, but if Crowley seems to be in a sense like a sort of Vishnu figure, avatar, which there's again this, or at least a solar avatar, which there's Egyptian forms. There's, again, I found Augustus Caesar is also 666, and like a lot of people talk about Nero, but Augustus Caesar, just considering one of the S's as a shin and the rest is Semek. I mean, there's that book, The 12 Caesars by Michael Grant. There's, Caesar connects to Tsar, but then there's also Gezar of Ling, that's sort of like Tibetan incarnation in a sense. Like, I don't know, it's just crazy. But I just think that this whole 666 thing, it's like gotten way out of hand in terms of, like, it's really crazy how universal it is, but people do not understand it, and yet there are very many like negative connotations to it. But yeah, there's a lot to this whole concept of Shabda, Dhvani, and Svota especially. But I'll just leave it there. And again, Wikipedia is just, it's not as good as the wisdom library as far as the sort of Sanskrit and Hindu knowledge, especially because it shows the different meanings. Just like in English, a single word can have so many different meanings. Dhvani, weaving. So that's like essentially what you're doing, weaving, but Dhvani would be like meditative or intelligent weaving. And so again, the Hindu philosophy of Dhvani. There's something to that. I just can't really like stress the value. Got pages and pages of like just different things about how I see that it can come in. That's why, again, like quantum hyperspace, it's a very like simple thing, but so many different conceivable things, again, with all the other things relating to this torus hypercube as probably a better sort of like shape for space-time. Anyway, again, that the whole concept of this labyrinth that I've talked about, the magnetism, there's like so many different paradigmal shifts that could be like, I don't know, but it seems like with this whole thing about like some ways that they're really trying to like not just brainwash people, but literally brain damage people, I think. So that, because if you notice, like I think the human mind and heart and mind complex is like a multi-dimensional. Hyperdimensional sounds more I don't know, whatever, but multi-dimensional, because we are multi-dimensional. Like, I think space-time is multi-dimensional. I think certain things can like dislocate our brain from that sort of fluidity. It's kind of bad, but anyway, yeah, I'll try to move on quicker with all this. And yeah, here's this next chapter or post, whatever you want to call it. That's when I finally found like the whole thing in Ion of Jung. This whole thing about Adamus, the 4 and the 5, like the fifth element essentially coming from this 4, and this relation of 107 and 111. But try to get to that soon. Now on with Persephone and the Ancient Secret. Chapter 10 of The Ancient Secret in Search of the Holy Grail by Flavia Anderson. The Grail Unveiled in Folk Tales. The reader will by now have become sufficiently acquainted with the various symbols in the periphrastic descriptions of the Grail to allow of a chapter being devoted to the enjoyment of folk tales, without the need of much help in interpreting them. The story of Ortnet is as good as any for a beginner. Ortnet, king of Lombardy, desired to have to wife the daughter of the heathen king of Tyre, for he had seen the damsel in a vision. Because it was necessary to delay sailing to Syria until the spring, Ortnet determined to subdue his impatience by riding into the mountains to seek adventure. His mother, fearing for his safety, gave him a ring of gold in which was a stone of little apparent value, but it had wonderful magical properties. Following her directions, he went through a forest until he found a wall of rock above a lake. From the rock gushed a spring, and close to it was a great lime tree. As the birds in this tree sang in honor of Alberic, king of the wood, the stone in Ortnet's ring shone like fire, and lit up the face of a lovely child who lay asleep in the grass. Ortnet, in pity, lifted the child to carry him away, but the little creature resisted him and proved to be miraculously strong. They fell to fighting, but finally came to terms. The child promised to give Ortnet a sword called Rosen. The king lent the boy his magic ring, whereupon the child promptly became invisible. Then, reappearing and restoring the ring, he declared himself to be none other than Alfric, king of the dwarves, and the true father of Ortnet, whose mother's lover he had been. He went underground to fetch for his son the magic sword, Rosen. It was in a golden sheath, its handle was a shining carbuncle, and on the sharp steel blade were golden figures and letters forming the king's name. Albric promised to go with his son Ortnet to Tyre to woo the daughter of the heathen king, Macarel, whose custom it was to impale the heads of his daughter's suitors on the castle walls. Ortnet and his uncle Elias, or Eligus, together with a train of knights and the invisible Albric, set out for Syria. After some fighting, Albric, always invisible, entered the heathen temple where the queen and her beautiful daughter, Sidrat, were praying before their idols. Albric took Sidrat's hand and in whispers persuaded her to abandon her home and to meet Ortnet without the walls. Ortnet then escaped with her to Italy. After some time, a messenger, Well, was sent by the wicked Tyrian king with precious gifts of gold and jewels to Ortnet's court. Amongst the gifts was a casket wherein were 2 enormous eggs of strange form and color. Well explained that they were the eggs of the Abrahamic magic toad. When hatched, there would be found in each a wondrous toad that would shine like the sun in a dark place, or else a marvelous creature would be found that would defend the coasts against every invader if only it were well fed. Well and his giant wife were appointed to guard the eggs in a place amongst the mountains, far within a cavern at the foot of a precipice. At length 2 lindworms, or dragons, were hatched, but they devastated the country in search of food to stay their monstrous appetites. King Ortnet, therefore, determined to slay them. He bade farewell to his wife, and told her that if he met his death she must remarry with his avenger, whom she would recognize by his wearing Ortnet's magic ring. With his dog to help him, the king sought the cavern. He slew well, but then Albric appeared and warned him that he would be slain by the lindworms. Albric then took back the magic ring from his son's hand, whereat Ortnet at once fell into a charmed sleep, and was at the mercy of the dragon serpents who devoured him. The dog returned to give Sidrat a sign that Ortnet was no more, and the shrieks of the young queen soon made the sad news known to all. When at length the king's avenger, Wolf Dietrich, slew the lindworms, he found the magic sword that the carbuncle with the carbuncle glowing in the cavern, together with the king's ring, and thus he was able to claim the hand of the widowed Sidrat. For the story of Ortnet, see Epics and Romances of the Middle Ages, adopted from the work of Dr. W. Wagner by M. W. McDowell. If we remember the beacons which guarded our British coasts against the Spanish Armada, we shall recognize the monsters which needed feeding with fuel, and in ancient days with sacrifice. Primitive peoples did not draw a sharp distinction between fish, water serpents, reptiles, and the like. The association of the reptilian egg with Tyre, the great center of glass manufacture, is interesting, and also its supposed connection with Abraham. In Brittany, some of the traditional folk tales, which from olden times were sung by the minstrels, were later rendered into verse by Mary de France, a Norman French lady who wrote in about AD 1175. The Bretons were refugees from Britain in the days of King Arthur, when the Saxon invasion drove them to the shores of Armorica, and their association with Cornwall and Wales remained a close one. They shared the same legends, and the following Lay of Yonec shows itself as a typical example of the tale of a Grail hero. Beside the banks of the river Douglas dwelt a lord well stricken in years, who took to wife a fair damsel. Because she was young and gay, he shut her fast within a tower, and set a widow, his sister, to hold her more surely in ward. So strictly was she guarded that not even a chamberlain or usher was permitted in her chamber to light the candles. Now when April had come, her lord went hunting, and the widow withdrew to read her psalter, so that the damsel was left alone in her prison to bewail her fate. When the lady had made her plaint to God, a great bird darkened the narrow window. This falcon flew into her chamber, and there before her eyes was transformed into a young and comely knight. The hawk knight, whose name was Eudemarec, promised to be as gentle as a dove if she would but grant him her love. The lady was much amazed at this sorcery, but she nevertheless uncovered her face and declared herself willing to give him her love, if only she had assurance of his faith in God. At his command she thereupon feigned sickness and persuaded the guardian dame to summon a priest to her aid. By his reception of the sacraments, Eudemarec proved himself to be a true Christian, and thenceforward he and the lady enjoyed each other's love, for she was able to summon the hawk to enter her window whenever she would. Nevertheless, Eudemarec warned her that if ever their love were to be known, he would perish. The old lord, noticing thereafter that his wife's youth and beauty were daily renewed, began to suspect her. He commanded the widow dame to hide behind the curtains of the chamber and to spy upon the lady. Presently she was able to report to him the truth of the matter. The husband then contrived a cunning gin for the slaying of the hawk. He fixed 4 razor-sharp blades of steel across the window, and when Eudemarec was next summoned by the lady, he dashed himself against the blades of steel, and his hurt was to the death. He fell upon the lady's bed so that her sheets were dabbled with his blood, but although so sorely wounded, he was nevertheless able to foretell to her that she would bear a son, who should be called Eunuch. Then, bleeding to death, the hawk flew away through the window. By the same aperture the lady made her own escape, and clad only in her shift, traced his path by means of the trail of blood, to a fair and rich city of which he was the lord. She found him upon his deathbed, and there he gave her a ring which had the power to prevent her husband suspecting or revenging his wrongs. He also gave her his sword, which was destined for the use of their unborn son only. Further, he foretold that when the child should be full grown, he would go with his mother and her lawful husband to a feast. They would lodge in an abbey, where would be seen a tomb surpassing fair. There her son must be told of his father's death. There he must be girt with the sword, and there hear the tale of his birth. After Eudemerec's death, the lady returned to her tower, and was duly delivered of a son, whom she named Eunuch. The husband of the lady remained untroubled by doubts because of the power of the ring. Now, when Eunuch was full grown, they all rode to a feast at Caerleon, but on the way they rested at an abbey, and there beheld a wondrous fair tomb. It was the tomb of Eudemarec, who in life had been king of that realm, and was greatly mourned by his people. The lady thereupon told Eunuch the secret of his birth, and plucking out the sword she tendered him the glaive, bidding him slay the ancient Judas at her side. Then she fell senseless across the tomb, and the soul left her body. Thus Eunuch was moved to smite the head from the old man's shoulders, and avenge his father's death. The people then acclaimed him for their lord and successor to the king Eudemarec. The account of how Eudemarec was cut to pieces by the bars across the windows should be compared with the following account in the Chevalier de la Charette, where Lancelot attempts to enter Queen Guinevere's window. "Do you not see," said the queen, "how the bars are stiff to bend and hard to break? You could never so twist, pull, or drag them as to dislodge one of them. "Lady," says he, "have no fear of that. It would take more than these bars to keep me out." Seizing the bars, he pulls and wrenches them until he makes them bend and drags them from their places. But the iron was so sharp that the end of his little finger was cut to the nerve, and the first joint of his next finger was torn. He stained the queen's bed with his blood. As Eudemarec and Lancelot are both plainly taking part of the sun god whose light enters the crystal window, one must ask what possible bars could have hindered the rays. There is the possibility that the bars are the spokes of the wheel, which the Indian eagle Garuda had to pass in order to reach the moon goblet. But as it is probable that the Celtic minstrel, under cover of a Christian facade, is bewailing the abolition of the ancient ritual, one might ask what crystal balls were enclosed with metal bands from the time of the Christian era only. The answer, I fancy, is that we have come up against the history of the royal orb, and it is wrapped in sufficient mystery to make one suspect that it originally concerned the old religion. Pythagoras, who, curiously enough, was the son of a gem engraver, see Life of Pythagoras by Diogenes Laertius, was the first to teach that the world was round, but his reasons for supposing this were not clearly given. It must of necessity be round, was the gist of his teaching, from which we might infer that his inherited knowledge of crystals led him to deduce that because the image of Vesta was spherical, the earth itself must follow out the symbolism. According to legend, he was given the very dart of Apollo by Abaris, a Hyperborean Celt. Amongst the educated Romans, a rather vague idea persisted that the earth was a globe. Ovid says that the earth was round like a ball, resting on no prop, and that therefore Vesta's temple was a circular building with a domed roof. Fasti 6, 249. Nevertheless, by the beginning of the 6th century AD, it was a punishable heresy for a Christian to believe that the earth was globe-shaped. The Church had by then definitely decreed it to be flat and square with 4 corners. How comes it then that the Christian emperors carried an orb as a symbol of the earth over which they ruled? I think it is very likely that the custom goes back to the ancient times when a priest-king held the crystal ball of his office as fire-maker. I think it is very likely that the custom goes back to the ancient times when a priest-king held the crystal ball of his office as fire-maker. In Munter's Symbols of the Ancient Church, the coin of Constantine shows him carrying an orb on which a phoenix perches, and the legend reads, Felix temporum reparatio. The later Roman emperors held simply a ball, and later still it was crowned with a cross or dove. Edward the Confessor's orb was a ball without decoration. William the Conqueror, the Duke of Normandy, was the first to surmount the British orb with a cross, and Henry I capped the cross with a dove. See Crown Jewels of England by Younghusband and Davenport. If we look at any illustration of a Christian orb, it will be seen that it is crossed with metal bands. It seems possible, therefore, that in this story of Eunuch, we have the lament of a pagan that the sun rays could no longer penetrate to a focal point through the old talisman, since its adoption as a Christian and royal symbol. For further discussion of the orb, see A.B. Cook's Zeus, Volume 1, page 41, with illustrations of Zeus holding a spherical object, which the writer takes to be the earth. He does not, however, attempt to explain how a globe came to represent the earth in the days when the earth was considered to be flat. In Germany and Austria, the orb of state is known as the Reichsapfel, i.e., the state apple. In the collection of Mary de France, we come next to the lay of Grelent, or Grelent. It is probable that in the character of Grelent, we have a priest of the mysteries rather than a solar god such as Eudemarec. Sir Grelent, says the lay, was a knight at the court of the king of Brittany. The queen offered him her love, but when she found that he would not betray his liege lord, and that moreover he extolled the virtues of chastity, her love for him turned to the hatred of a woman scorned. She so wrought that Grelent was reduced to direst poverty, and at last the only possession left him was his horse. Sadly he rode through the forest, until on a sudden he spied a white hart, whiter than snow on winter branches. He gave chase, and the hart led him to a fountain in which a lady was bathing. Her raiment was set on a bush near by, and the two maidens stood on the bank busied with their lady's service. She was slender and white, and Grelent had never seen so lovely a dame. He came softly to the bush to set hands upon her raiment, and bade her come forth and clothe herself, for, said he, you have to say a certain word to me. Grelent then declared his love for her, and she in turn promised him her heart and great riches beside. Moreover, the lady told him that night and day she would stay with him and ride by his side, but that she must never be seen of his comrades, nor must they know aught concerning her. For if he ever were to speak vainly and boastfully of this thing, then she would be undone. Sir Grelent returned to his lodging, and for a year he enjoyed great riches in the company of the dame, who in fairy fashion came and went whenever he so prayed her. But at the feast of Pentecost the king of Brittany held a banquet, and at it he declared before all his lords and knights that no woman was so fair as his queen. All the king's vassals affirmed that this was so, save Grelent alone, who from love of truth refused to echo such a falsehood. For his part, therefore, he declared that he knew a woman far more beautiful and many times more gracious. On pain of dire punishment, the king was bidden to make good his boast, and to bring the lady to the court, that all might judge of the truth of his words. For a full year Grelent sought his lady of the fountain, but in vain, for, because of his disclosure of their secret, she had withdrawn herself from him. At the end of the year he was obliged to return to the king, who sat in hall with his lords to pronounce judgment upon the knight for the dishonor he had done the queen. While all waited thus, on a sudden there arrived 2 young and beautiful damsels, and 2 more followed to herald the approach of the lady of the fountain. When the dame herself came into the hall, the whole court marveled at her beauty and at the richness of her kirtle of red silk embroidered in gold. She bade the king gaze boldly on her face, and he and his lords had need to concede that her beauty was far greater than that of any girl of mother born. When at length she rode away with her attendant damsels, Grelent followed her, but never a word of comfort would she say to him. At last they came to the forest, and riding through it, they reached the bank of a fair clear stream. The lady set her palfrey to the river, but when she saw that Grelent also would enter therein, she cried to him, "Stay, Sir Grelent, the stream is deep, and it is death for you to follow." Grelent took no heed of her words, and twice he strove to ride through the stream, and twice the lady saved him from peril and set him upon the near bank. A third time he forced his horse to enter the water, but the current was swift and the stream deep. Grelent was torn from his saddle, and being borne away by the stream, was like to drown. The damsels besought their lady to have pity upon the knight, and at last she took compassion on him and bore him from the water to the far bank. So she brought him safely into her own land of faery, and none has seen Sir Grelent since that day. But the Breton folk, so the lay declares, hold firmly that Sir Grelent yet lives with his friend, and the horse of Sir Grelent, being left masterless in the forest, continually seeks the knight. He paws with his hoofs upon the ground, and neighs so loudly that the noise goes through all the country round about, and each year in its season the forest is filled with the cry and trouble of this noble beast. Before commenting upon the story of Grelent, let us first consider the lay of Sir Launfal in the collection of Marie de France, for his adventure is almost identical, but with these small differences. He is a knight of King Arthur's court at Caerleon on Usk. Before his meeting with the fairy dame, he comes to a stream which his horse fears to cross. He is welcomed by two damsels, one of whom carries a basin of pure gold, and the other a towel of white linen. They bid him come, not to any fountain, but to the pavilion of the lady. Above her tent is set an eagle of gold, and lances of gold hold the pavilion aloft. The lady is whiter than any altar lily, and more sweetly flushed than the rose. She lies on a bed with napery and coverlet of rich worth. Like the dame of the fountain, she is slender, and her vesture is of spotless linen. Sir Launfal's refusal of the lustful wife of King Arthur takes place in an orchard. When the fairy dame presents herself at Caerleon for the judgment, she looses her mantle so that the king may more readily perceive her beauty. When she rides away from Caerleon, the lay recounts nothing further but that the Bretons tell that the knight was ravished by this lady to an island, very dim and very fair, known as Avalon. In these two lays there is much food for thought. Both stress the need for secrecy. The Grail is unveiled only to the initiate priest and to the king and his hierarchy. In both accounts the fairy is described as slender, and while no doubt a slim figure was admired by the contemporaries of Marie de France, there is nevertheless a punning on the word, which was intended to be understood by the initiates only. It will be remembered that Wolfram von Eschenbach claimed that his source for the tale of Parzival was the Provençal minstrel Quiot, and Wolfram furthermore stated that the Grail stone was called lapis adzilis. Adzilis is the Latin for slender. If Wolfram had not been tempted to show off his scholarship by rendering the name of the stone into Latin, he would have preserved the ancient and periphrastic punning in its original form. For in the French language, Grail has the double meaning of slender and also of a hailstone or ice stone. In other words, a spherical crystal. The reader will have guessed that the stream, which both knights feared to cross, is the subterranean waters of the Axe and Wookey Hole, where the hooves of Sir Grelent's horse are still heard upon the roof of the witch's parlor. This brings us to the question of what lies behind the deep-rooted belief of the Celts, particularly of the Scots, in the existence of a water-horse, the terrible Ichusig. Mr. Lewis Spence, in his Minor Traditions of British Mythology, gives a long and excellent account of what superstitions were current about this mythical monster. It had the appearance of a beautiful black steed, and was accustomed to persuade the ignorant to mount it. Then it would gallop off at a terrible pace, and the poor wretch, seated upon it and clinging to the mane, would only then observe with horror the telltale water-weeds entwined therein. If the rider could not fling himself off in time, the Ichusig would dash with him into the waters of a lake, and devour him in a submarine Hades. In view of the undoubted existence of the Grail ritual in all European countries, and its obvious derivation from the Near East, it seems to me that the Ichusig is none other than the water-horse of the Nile, the hippopotamus, which, being unknown to the Celts except by hearsay, was all the more terrible to the imagination. Furthermore, there is no doubt that it did have fearsome associations with the debased ritual of Hades. In Chaldea, the awful goddess of the dead, Alat, is represented in her bark or ship, standing upon the back of a horse. See Dawn of Civilization by Professor Maspero, pages 690 and 91. In Egypt, as we have seen in the illustration on page 42, figure 1, the hippo goddess Rerit represents the constellation which we know as Draconis, the dragon, and was therefore one of the terrible cherubim whose wheeling movements kept man from the fruit of the tree of life. if indeed it was conceived to be at the pole star. There is a strange link between horses and the fire cult, for at Nemi, the divine youth was supposed to have been Hippolytus restored to life, and horses were excluded by taboo from the sanctuary. See The Golden Bow, Book 1, Chapter 1, page 20. It is so apparent that a memory of the hawk-headed god and the lofty crane were preserved in Celtic legend that there is nothing to prevent us supposing that in the EXEMPTION, a memory of the water horse of the Nile has been equally well preserved. And there is no doubt at all that the demon steed which Percival mounted, and which carried him into the waters, fortunately to be rescued by a saint of Christian aspect, is the Celtic EXEMPTION. Far the most interesting point in these two lays, however, lies in the account of the lady bathing in the fountain. What is this myth which we find so constantly repeated of the goddess surprised while bathing? In Greece, Actaeon came upon Artemis, the moon goddess, thus unclothed and bathing with her attendants in a spring, and lest he boast of having seen the goddess naked, she changed him into a stag, and he was torn to death by his own hunting dogs. It might be argued that this story describes the reflection of the moon in the water, but then what of the legendary bride of King Athamas? He was the father of Phrixus in Hell, or Hele, and with him begins the adventure of the Golden Fleece, which, as has already been shown, is intimately connected with the fire cult. Athamas surprised 3 nymphs bathing in a pool. The better to observe them, he hid behind a great black rock, which stood on one side of the river. He stole the clothes of the most beautiful of the 3 maidens, and she thus was constrained to become his wife and the mother of Phrixus and Hele. Her name, Nephile, meaning in Greek a cloud, is at first misleading, until we realize that she is not the beautiful cloud of the sky, but the goddess imprisoned in Niflheim, the obscurity and dark shadow of the caverns of the dwarves. Callimachus, in an elegy on the bath of Pallas, says, "But thou, O Pelasgian, beware lest even against thy will thou behold the queen. Whoso shall have seen Pallas, the city's guardian, naked, this Argos shall behold him now for the last time." Thereafter Tiresias unfortunately glimpses the ablutions of the goddess and is struck blind. And the adventures of this same Tiresias had begun upon a mountain top, where he inadvertently beheld the convolutions of 2 snakes mating. Finally, one is brought with some difference to reflect on the apocryphal story of Susanna and the elders. Is this a Jewish version of the same myth from which all mention of gods and goddesses has been dutifully expunged by the servants of the one God? Susanna, the virtuous wife of Joachim, a Jew living in Babylon during the exile, bade her maids bring oil and washing balls and to shut the garden doors so that she might take her bath alone in the garden. The maids left her, and the 2 elders who had been hiding in the garden with vicious intent rushed out and surprised the lady. They attempted to persuade her to yield to their lustful desires by the threat of bringing false witness, to the effect that she was seen in the garden with a young man. Susanna, whose name signifies a lily, and who may perhaps have taken her name from the lotus, out of whose petals the Egyptian sun god was supposed to be born, refused to yield to such threats. She was thereupon brought to judgment, and her face was uncovered, to her great embarrassment. Her confusion seems unwarranted, since the monuments depict Babylonian women as showing their faces, and the Jews have never veiled their women as the Muslims do. Daniel then came to her rescue and confounded her accusers by separately questioning them as to what species of tree it was under which they had seen Susanna lying with her lover. One answered under a mastic, and the other under a holm tree, and their witness was therefore proved to be false. It is possible that we have here not the judgment of a woman, but the judgment of two strangers who had sought to witness a mystery without the qualifications and passwords of initiation. And would the elders have escaped death if they had been able to answer, "Under a little golden tree"? If we are right in supposing that the same thread runs through all these stories of a goddess bathing, then the meaning would seem to be that when the sacred fire was lit by means not of a mirror or solid crystal, but by a hollow sphere of glass, it was necessary to fill the glass coracle with water. This may have been done at the holy well of Glastonbury, but wherever the ritual washing and filling took place, it would no doubt have been conducted amongst a circle of initiates only. I have not yet been able to trace from what source Tennyson drew his inspiration for writing The Lady of Shalott, but it is difficult to believe that he invented a tale which bears so dramatically on our research. The death of the lady and the transport of her corpse by barge are mentioned in La Mort le Roi Artus, but so far I can find no ancient source for the description of the web and the mirror. From the bank and from the river he flashed into the crystal mirror. "Tira lira by the river," sang Sir Lancelot. And so the Vestal maiden, who was perhaps engaged in bathing and filling the glass, was so dazed with the beauty of the spear of Lot, the sun god, that in her abstraction her mirror was cracked. One cannot help wondering what would have been the fate of a Vestal who carelessly damaged the sacred symbol of the goddess. She might well have been thrown by the Druids as a victim to the river. The veil of the goddess is alluded to in the story of Dietrich of Bern. See Epics and Romances of the Middle Ages, adapted from the work of Dr. W. Wagner by M. W. McDowell. The Bern of which he was prince had nothing to do with Switzerland, but is the German form of Verona, and the Dietrich of this legend is supposed to be none other than Theodoric the Ostrogoth, conqueror of Italy. The young prince and his tutor, Hildebrand, rode out to slay a giant and giantess. A dwarf prince gave Dietrich a magic sword, Nagelring, and the youth found the giant pair in a cave lighted by a fire. He decapitated the giant, slew the giantess, and brought certain treasure which they had guarded back to Bern. Dietrich then had a vision of the elfin queen, Virginal, who lived amongst the glaciers and snow mountains, and was held captive by the magician Ortgius. After various adventures, Dietrich fought with a black horseman, who disappeared when the first rays of the sun were seen. The prince then defeated a dragon and won his way to the castle of Virginal. Unmoved by the turmoil and fighting around her, she sat surrounded by her trembling maidens. A great carbuncle glowed in her diadem, and a silver veil was wrapped about her. The queen's only protection was a magic circle, which her assailants could not pass. Dietrich then slew the black horseman, a great clap of thunder was heard, avalanches fell, and ice fields broke up. The spell was broken and the queen delivered, and she bestowed her elfin hand in marriage on the mortal prince. It is possible that in this story the home of the imprisoned Grail is conceived to be in the Alps, which is the finest source of rock crystal in Europe. Andrew Lang's rendering of the tale of Pretty Goldilocks is an excellent example of a legend which has undergone no alteration from later Christian influence. The raven, as will be shown later, was the symbol of an initiate or druid. The owl was the recognized attribute of the virgin goddess Pallas Athena, and represents here an attendant Vestal. The king desires to wed a certain princess, and sends Prince Charming as his ambassador to plead his suit. On his journey, the prince restores a dying carp to the water, rescues a raven from pursuit by an eagle, and extricates an owl from a trap. The princess, who, though of surpassing beauty, is somewhat self-willed, refuses to favor his embassy until he shall have performed certain tasks. First, he must recover her ring, which she had let slip into the river. The carp remembers the prince's kindness and brings him the ring in its mouth. Charming is next ordered to bring the head of her enemy. He fights with this giant and is almost overcome when the raven flies at the giant's eyes and pecks them out. Lastly, the princess commands him to go to a terrible cavern, wherein is the fountain of health and beauty. From it he must fill the crystal vessel which she gives him. He approaches the entrance to the cavern and sees a black and hideous rock, from which comes a thick smoke. The original story being French, this must surely be the witch of Wookiee and her brand. But the well is guarded by 2 dragons. The owl then comes to his aid, and, taking the crystal vase in her claws, flies to the magic well and returns with the vessel filled. The princess can no longer refuse to wed the king, the sun god, but after a year the king grows jealous of the prince's prowess, and casts poor Charming into a dungeon. Then, wishing to be as handsome as the hero, the king attempts to bathe his face in the water of the crystal vessel. But some careless maid has substituted a lethal draught for the elixir. The king sleeps to wake no more, and Prince Charming is promptly liberated by the princess. The connection of the raven with Grail legend can now be more fully examined. To be a raven was a recognized degree of initiation in the cult of Mithras. See The Mysteries of Mithra by Franz Cumont, page 154. But the association of the bird with the mysteries goes back far earlier than the cult of the Iranian demigod. In the scriptures we find the raven issuing as a messenger from Noah's Ark, and the same birds fed the prophet Elijah. 2 ravens were in constant attendance upon Odin, and as has been recounted, one of them was concerned in bringing Freya's apple to the father of Volsung. In Germany, the following superstition was commonly believed, namely that the raven stone had marvelous talismanic powers, if only one could come to possess it. The instructions for how to set about this task are given in these words in the Westfälische Sagen. When you have discovered the raven's nest, you must climb the tree and take your chance that the parent birds are at least 100 years old, for otherwise you will have your trouble for nothing. You are then to kill one of the nestlings, which must be a male bird. Then you may descend the tree, but be very careful to mark well the spot where it stands, for by and by it will become invisible. As soon as the raven comes back and lays a raven stone in the throat of its dead nestling, when it has done this, you may go up and secure the stone. There is also a tale of how the raven's feathers were once white, but that they turned black after the coming of Christianity. For myths regarding the raven, see Provincial Names and Folklore of British Birds by Reverend C. Swainson. From all this, we can deduce that the Druids, or other priests who had charge of the Grail Stone, were known as ravens, and that from the time of the Christian era, they no longer wore their white linen robes. Ovid tells us that 3 constellations are grouped together, the raven, the snake, and the bull, which lies midway between the 2. He tries to explain their association in a story which has obviously suffered in transmission. Phoebus, preparing a feast for Jupiter, bade the raven fetch water from running springs in a gilded bowl. The raven was tempted to delay at an unripe fig tree, where he waited for the fruit to ripen. Then he ate his fill, snatched up a water snake in his talons, and returned to Phoebus with a bold lie that the snake had blocked the living water and kept the spring from flowing. Phoebus punished the raven by declaring that he should drink of no cool spring water until the figs on the tree were juicy. Fausti 2, 243. In Wales, the word for raven was bran, and here we are in danger of error, for we must not confuse the Welsh raven with the Teutonic word from which we get brand, burning, etc. It is possible that, since the ritual was so widespread, The sacred flame and its attendant priest did originally share some form of the same name, but this is a subject which must be left to qualified etymologists. From the collection of Marie de France, the Lay of the Two Lovers gives, I think, an account of the raven priest climbing the Tor with the Grail in his hands. In Normandy, near the city of the Valley of Pistres, is a great mountain where lies the relics of the two children. The king of the city would not give his daughter in marriage, save to the man who should be able to carry her to the summit of the mountain. Many knights tried and failed, and at length a young squire, beloved of the princess, decided to essay the feat. On her advice, he sought a magic potion from her aunt, who was a sorceress in Salerno, and had he but drunk the potion, no trial would have been beyond his strength. But as he struggled up the mount with the maiden in his arms, all the people who had been summoned to witness the feat made a great clamor and shouting, and his pride forbade him to drink of the potion. Many times the maiden urged him to sip of the cordial, but always he refused, until at length he fell dead upon the summit, for his heart had burst. The maiden sank down beside him, and there died of grief, and they were buried on that spot in a marble coffin amidst general mourning. The hill is known as the Mountain of the Two Lovers. If this is indeed the account of a druidical procession up to a Tor, one cannot help wondering whether the hero has acquired his youthful appearance posthumously, and whether the original lay did not concern an aged hierarch. It is very likely that some of the elderly druids sometimes did find the ascent of a steep mountain beyond their powers. One trembles to think what might befall some of our more elderly bishops and ministers if their duties required them to hold regular services on the summit of some of the Welsh hills, or upon Arthur's Seat outside Edinburgh. Moreover, the suggestion of the little tot of brandy, provided by the wife against emergency and ignored by the proud and courageous old man, has about it the flavor of a very human tragedy. From the same collection of Breton lays rendered into French verse by Marie de France comes the lay of Gugemar. In the days of King Arthur, a certain knight, whose name was Gugemar, went hunting and wounded a wonderful beast, a white hind which bore antlers. The arrow returned to pierce the knight's own thigh, and the hind foretold that the wound should remain unhealed until a woman should bring balm to the sore, who for her love would suffer pain and sorrow. Gugemar proceeded on his way in great dolour, and in a landlocked harbour he found a solitary vessel, bearing on it a rich pavilion of silk. Within the pavilion was the bed of Solomon with linen sheets, and there were torches and candlesticks of fine gold set beside it. While Gugemar sat in anguish upon the bed, the vessel sailed and brought him to an ancient city. This city was ruled by a king who was full of years, and so jealous was he of his lady, who was of tender age, that he had shut her in a tower. Beneath the tower was an orchard surrounded by a high wall. The first room in the tower was the young queen's chapel, and beyond it her bedchamber. None might enter the tower save only a damsel, who was kinswoman to the queen, and an aged priest, who recited mass in the chapel and served the queen's plate and cup. It presently befell that the queen and her damsel saw from the orchard the arrival of the strange ship into port, and greatly daring they went down to the shore, and beheld Gugemar lying as one dead upon Solomon's bed. He awoke and told the queen of his misfortune, and she, desiring to heal him of his wound, brought him back to her bedchamber in the tower and laid him on her own bed. When she had healed him, the lady granted the knight her love, and for 1.5 years he dwelt in her tower with great delight. Then fortune turned her wheel. The queen, fearing that the knight would presently depart, made a knot in his shirt, which no woman but herself should be able to unravel. and bade him love none other than she who could undo the knot. For his part, he put a girdle about his lady's waist with a secret clasp and buckle, and bade her never grant her love save only to him who could free her without injury to band or clasp. Presently their love was discovered by a chamberlain who looked through the window. The king parted the lovers. Gugemar sailed away in his magic ship back to Brittany. The queen was imprisoned in a terrible tower of grey marble, but at last she escaped, and the lovers were reunited in Brittany, where they recognized and undid the knot and clasp of their love tokens. Here Gugemar is the solar god, who journeys north in summer and returns south in the winter. The magic ship is the ark chest, wherein is kept the Grail in its Solomonic setting, and in this bed the sun possesses the goddess. The hind is not a female but male beast, for in Scotland the term hind was anciently used for a stag. The fact to be particularly noted here is that the bed is specially mentioned as having been made by Solomon's craftsmen, and, like Nashin's, Gugemar is lamed. But the tale has nothing to do with the quest for the cup of the Last Supper, which shows, I think, that the legend of the sacramental cup was a late Christian introduction to a much older myth. At a first glance, the love token worn by the lady would seem to be the iron girdle of chastity, so frequently spoken of in crusading times, until one remembers the famous buckle of Isis, a talisman of red quartz, which is mentioned in the 156th chapter of the Book of the Dead, and portrayed on many monuments. Chapter 4 of Part 2 of Persephone, A Study of Two Worlds by D. Streitfeld. The role of the senses. The question of the role played by the senses in the determination of our picture of the outer world may be approached from two sides. First, the investigation of the causes behind that spontaneous, normal, universal reliance on sensory experience as a confirmation of outer world reality, which we have already noted, and secondly, the consideration of the role which it plays in scientific method. It will be convenient to take the latter first. The role of sensory experience in scientific method. Ever since Galileo dropped his 2 stones from the Leaning Tower of Pisa, demonstration by sensory experience has been the keystone of scientific method. Nothing, the scientist insists, may be accepted as true simply because we believe it, however strong our conviction, nor because it has been reported to us, however great the reliability of our informant. It must be demonstrable in the form of a sensory experience which can be reconstructed by anybody at any place or time. The so-called scientific experiment, if it is successful, is in reality the demonstration of the truth of a hypothesis. The demonstrator, in effect, says to the world at large, "Observe that when I do this, and this, something definite happens. The pointer moves on the scale, the bell rings, the liquid changes color, the mouse dies, or whatever it may be. You have seen or heard it yourself, you cannot deny it. If you still don't believe me, you can try for yourself, anywhere and at any time. If you do exactly as I have done, you will end with the same sensory experience or its equivalent. It therefore follows that the conditions in question always produce the like results, which may be formulated thus and thus. This is a scientific law. The simple type of the scientific demonstration is Dr. Johnson's attack on the curbstone. There, the proof of the hypothesis by the sensory experience is obvious, and the same applies to the simple demonstrations which we are shown at school. The results of more complex experiments, on the other hand, may be presented in some indirect form, such as a table of figures or a graph, and the chain of reasoning by which the results are connected with the hypothesis may contain many stages in demonstration. To the layman, therefore, the universality of the sensory confirmation may not be apparent. To him, the scientist appears to reach his results principally by way of arcane computations in his mind. and he accepts them as established truths solely because of the prestige which the scientist enjoys in his eyes. The scientist himself, however, never loses sight of the necessity of sensory confirmation at every stage of his reasoning, and every law and principle which he quotes must have been the subject of a demonstration which he has himself carried out, or seen carried out in the course of his training. Sensory confirmation remains indispensable to scientific method, however much it may be overlaid by symbols on paper. So far as science is concerned, it is the sole and exclusive criterion of truth. This matter is important, because nearly every inhabitant of a civilized country nowadays has some acquaintance with scientific method, and the basic ideas of science are so much in the air that they tend to color all our thinking. People have, of course, always relied on the evidence of their senses above all else, but hitherto they have been prepared to accept the truth and reality of many other things, not demonstrable by sensory experience as well. They have believed in some kind of invisible world, and have been encouraged to do so by teachers who recognized in such beliefs an indispensable counterpoise to the crass materialistic attitude which the struggle with outer circumstances tends to induce in most people. Nowadays, on the other hand, although a few teachers of religion and of the humanities still insist on the reality of the incorporeal and imponderable, a greater number of authorities whose prestige stands higher with the general public are, at least inferentially, proclaiming that nothing is real or true which we cannot touch or see. I have even read the assertion by a distinguished scientist that nothing should be accepted as true that could not be made the subject of an experiment, and that it was scarcely ever permissible to make generalized statements about classes of objects, e.g. horses or the horse, but only particular statements about individual exemplars. This is no more than a crude form of medieval nominalism. Such ideas are not usually stated or accepted in so many words, and a great many people, if asked, would sincerely assert that they believed in the reality of things not demonstrable to the senses. When it comes to decisions affecting their conduct, however, they generally tacitly assume the contrary. Thus, nowadays, the tendency to attach a disproportionate, almost exclusive reliance on the evidence of the senses is no longer, as it used to be, merely a weakness of the unreflecting man, adequately counterbalanced by the united voices of the intelligentsia. It has grown into an elaborate theoretical system, sponsored by a great part of that very intelligentsia, whose proper and indispensable function should be to direct the thoughts of their fellows into less materialistic channels. I have said that for science, sensory demonstration is the sole and exclusive criterion of truth. But this naturally does not mean that science as a system of thought, or that scientists as individuals, necessarily deny the validity of other matters altogether. The difference is commonly formulated by saying that science has no concern with values, the validity of which is accepted as something universally experienced which is not susceptible of proof or demonstration by scientific methods. If people consistently maintained this distinction, all would be well. But unfortunately, the enormous prestige enjoyed by science today has the inevitable effect of depreciating the importance and, above all, the reality of everything which is not susceptible of scientific demonstration. Scientists, or pseudoscientists, moreover, are tempted by the success which has attended their method in its proper sphere to attempt to apply it in spheres which are in fact alien to it. Attempts are forever being made to establish material or concrete causation for mental phenomena. It is, for instance, suggested that visions of the mystics were due to vitamin deficiency and so forth. The point here is that while it cannot be denied that vitamin deficiency, the action of drugs, and other physical causes may affect the condition of consciousness, thus making available to it regions of the mind which are normally inaccessible, Yet the contents which consequently appear in consciousness are themselves purely mental phenomena, and are in no way dependent on the nature of the physical cause which makes them available to consciousness. Descartes was possibly drunk on the night of his great dreams, St. Paul was conceivably an epileptic, Coleridge took laudanum, and St. Anthony of Egypt and the children of Fatima were probably suffering from vitamin deficiencies. Are we to suppose that if Coleridge had suffered from vitamin deficiencies, St. Paul had taken laudanum, and Descartes had been epileptic, the consequences would have been any different? The content and nature of the visions of the mystics, as well as of other people, are found to conform to their own laws and patterns, no matter by what physical means consciousness is predisposed to perceive them. It is once again a question of distinguishing between the two worlds. We have now to ask the reason why the scientific outlook is so insistent on the sensory confirmation of all hypotheses. What is there about sensory experience that gives it such a particularly high value? The first thing to be noted is that although the scientist insists on a sensory experience of some kind as the criterion of truth, he is not interested in the sensory experience in its own right, but solely in something that it represents. The sphere of mental activity which is devoted to sensory material in its own right is the aesthetic, for it is only there that sensory experience is evaluated, differentiated, and studied according to its own nature, and without division of interest to any extraneous considerations. To those who have developed aesthetic discrimination, a sensory experience has value in itself, quite apart from what it may represent. But this attitude is completely alien to the scientific viewpoint. The scientist, as an individual, may of course appreciate aesthetic values just as well as anybody else, but as a scientist he is not concerned with them. This is one of the reasons for the deterioration of artistic taste in modern highly civilized communities. The scientific outlook, and all that it implies, has developed the interpretative approach to sensory experience to such a high degree that, in the average mind, the direct appreciation of the material itself is almost totally suppressed, and can only be brought to the surface by means of a sustained course of study. We shall be concerned with this matter in the next volume of this series. For the moment, our interest lies in that which the sensory experience is regarded as representing, and in the terms of which it is interpreted. To the scientist, of course, and to nearly any contemporary mind, the question does not appear in this light at all. As he sees it, the sensory impression is tantamount to reality. If, like Dr. Johnson, he kicks a stone, he believes that he is directly experiencing the real, independent outer world through the medium of the nerves of his foot, and it is in that supposed outer reality that he is interested. He is, in fact, identifying himself with his foot, just as we commonly identify ourselves with our eyes and ears, or at least with our brains, regarding the whole organism as identical with the self, and the area outside it as the not-self or outer world. But as we have seen, this position is untenable. For all practical purposes it is serviceable, but if we wish to look more deeply into the processes of the mind, we must abandon it. The contents of consciousness arise from various sources, and sensory impressions are only one of them. Therefore, in order to reduce them all to a common denominator, we must treat the sensory material solely as a mental content, equivalent to any other. We know that it is found to conform to its own special laws and patterns, but so do thoughts and feelings, and there is no reason why we should accord a superior validity to one pattern than to another. In the light of this consideration, the question takes on a new form. We are not so much concerned with the nature and intrinsic values of the sensory experience, for that we saw as a question of aesthetics, with which science is not concerned. What we are concerned with is the pattern to which certain elements of sensory experience conform, and which is commonly regarded as being the reflection of an independent outer world. In order to understand this, we may turn to our second question, namely why, quite apart from scientific theory, sensory experiences should produce in us such a particularly strong sense of conviction and reality. The instinctive basis. Seeing is believing. I could hardly believe my own eyes. These are familiar phrases which illustrate the profound reliance which we place in our sensory perceptions. Yet experience, or the stream of consciousness, consists of a medley of conceptual thoughts, words, feelings, and sensory images, some of which are derived from memory, while others present themselves spontaneously to the imagination, as well as present sensory experience. We have demonstrated that there is no adequate reason for attributing any intrinsically greater degree of reality, importance, or validity to any of these elements of experience rather than to any other. Nevertheless, we cannot help ourselves. Argue as we may, we cannot free ourselves of the conviction that what we see with our own eyes, or touch or hear, is in some mysterious way a more reliable guide to reality, or in other words, that it possesses greater validity and importance than anything apprehended in any other way. Some people trust logical deductions, others their feelings, others again hunches or flashes of intuitive insight, as guides sufficiently reliable to base their actions upon. But those who place reliance on one of these will almost invariably be found to mistrust the others. Yet everybody, without exception, places reliance on the evidence of his senses. Why is this so? I have suggested above that the vividness or intensity of any experience is often our criterion as to the degree of its reality. On reflecting on it afterwards, we may come to deny it reality in the outer world sense, because it fails in some way to fit into our picture of the outer world. But our immediate reaction to a vivid experience is normally to regard it as real, and if we can see no objection of the kind indicated, we will accord it to outer world reality. Secondly, I pointed out that our instincts are still the source of many of our most intense experiences. It may therefore be worth looking for the explanation of our problem in our true instinctual equipment. It is immediately evident that sensory stimuli cause release of nearly all instinctive reactions in the animal world, and man is obviously no exception. Here, then, would appear to be the answer to our question. The spontaneous intensity of our reaction to sensory experience is simply instinctive. But we have noted that instincts consist solely of specific and highly specialized responses to very narrowly circumscribed stimuli, and it is doubtful whether a heterogeneous collection of such separate, limited, and very specialized reactions could become generalized into the kind of attitude which we are considering. It is necessary, therefore, to carry the investigation further. The explanation, I think, is to be found in one particular instinct, that of curiosity, or the tendency to investigate the unfamiliar. This tendency is to be found in varying degrees in most of the higher animals, and is, of course, particularly pronounced in the primates, and presumably in man. The inquisitiveness of monkeys is proverbial, and it appears beyond question that the same tendency carried to an even higher degree must have been one of the most important factors in the development of the human mentality. This instinct is peculiar, perhaps unique, in that it is activated not by the presence of a particular sign stimulus, but rather apparently by the absence of any. A great deal of experiment would be necessary in order to elucidate its exact workings, and we must, of course, beware of imputing our own motivations to animals. The animal presumably does not experience curiosity in the human sense, namely the desire to know and understand, but it is undeniable that a great many animals, and particularly young animals, are impelled to approach and investigate unfamiliar objects. When this occurs, two tendencies may be observed working in opposite directions. On the one hand, fear or apprehensiveness impelling to flight, and on the other, the impulse to approach. This combination would obviously have survival value in those species capable of learning from individual experience, since the unfamiliar object might be dangerous, or might on the other hand be beneficial. An example of the latter is to be found in the tendency of some small birds, notably robins, to follow larger animals, including human beings, because the latter often disturb the surface of the earth and thereby expose grubs, etc. See Lack. Any gardener can confirm the fact for himself. In this case, it is probable that a positive sign stimulus is involved, i.e., the bird is impelled to approach the object, not because it is unfamiliar, but because it is a large moving form. The recognition of unfamiliarity, indeed, implies mental powers which are probably not to be found in any but the highest animals, since before an object can be recognized as unfamiliar, it must first be identified as an individual entity, separate from its environment, and its image must then be compared with all the categories of familiar objects. Accurate investigation would therefore probably disclose that animals are impelled to approach and investigate by certain positive sign stimuli, e.g., movement of a rapid and irregular nature, bright color, etc., rather than by the negative quality of unfamiliarity. However this may be, there can be no question that most animals are instinctively impelled to approach and investigate certain classes of object, in the nature of which they are uncertain, i.e., such as are not immediately recognizable by comparison with one or other of the stock of innate recognition images, such as those representing its food, its enemies, members of its own species, etc. For examples of such images, see Tinbergen. When an object is recognized as one of these latter, the reaction is swift and certain. The impulse to approach the unknown, however, being held in check by apprehensiveness, is uncertain, which is an unusual feature in animal behavior. This uncertainty is the key to the whole pattern. It must be the rudimentary form of what we know as doubt, and it demands alleviation by reassurance. It is probably this function of reassurance by sensory investigation which forms the basis of our picture of the outer world. The majority of animals reassure themselves by the use of the sense of smell. In mankind, the corresponding role is played by that of touch, and it is in tactile sensations that we seek our final confirmation of outer world reality. There can be no doubt that the human impulse to pick things up with the hand or to finger, grip, or shake them is a true instinct. We can observe its irrational working today in the inveterate tendency of sightseers to finger anything which excites their wonder, even a picture. Is it really real? Obviously, to an animal which uses its hands to the extent which man does, the feel of an object is of vital importance. The questions whether it is fixed or loose, hard or soft, rigid or pliable, light or heavy, are constantly requiring answers. When instinctive man is in doubt, therefore, he touches, just as a dog smells. In this connection, it is interesting to consider our attitude to everyday hallucination of the senses in dreams. The most commonly involved, of course, is vision. Dreams are commonly experienced as something seen, and although a great deal of them is made up, similarly to the experiences of waking life, of a direct experience of the meaning of what is going on, while the visual elements remain in the background, we can generally, although by no means always, say what the characters in our dreams looked like. Frequently, moreover, visual images occur in their own right and are experienced with considerable intensity. We are suddenly confronted by a vividly seen landscape, the image of an animal or object, or whatever it may be. Auditory images are less common, for although dream characters commonly speak, we are normally aware, as in waking life, only of what has been said and not of the sound of the voice as such. When a disembodied voice speaks, or the voice of a visible speaker is distinctly heard as a sound, the impression of reality is considerably heightened, and, as Jung says, When this occurs, it is evidence that the dream in question is unusually important. The tactile sense, however, is scarcely ever involved, a fact which is substantiated by the familiar phrase, to pinch oneself to make sure that one is awake. I have, however, experienced one very vivid tactile sensation in a dream. A bird perched on my hand, and the characteristic light, cool, hard feel of its claws on my skin has left an ineradicable impression on my mind. This was, needless to say, a great dream, full of pure archetypal symbolism, but it was the rare tactile impression which gave the crowning touch to its unforgettable reality. Thus, we do not place complete confidence in the evidence of vision and hearing, because even in waking life they are fallible on account of the stupendous demands we make of them. Sometimes, at a distance, we mistake a stranger for a friend, or the sound of a bicycle bell for the ringing of a telephone. With regard to touch, however, from which we expect no such prodigies of fine differentiation, we are completely confident. Sight or hearing, we know, may on occasion betray us, but touch, we believe, never can. It was by the sovereign evidence of his sense of touch that St. Thomas finally allowed himself to be convinced of the reality of the resurrected body of the Savior. The strongest reassurance of all is obtained by the confirmatory evidence of two or more senses, in particular vision and touch. It is on this combination that our conception of material bodies is founded, and the expectation that the confirmation of one by the other will be forthcoming is so profoundly embedded in our picture of reality that the mere notion of not being able to feel something which we see in the form of a material object is enough to plunge us into a panic horror. The idea, of course, is the standby of ghost stories. This generalized image of material objects as things which may be both touched and seen is so basic to our thinking that its importance cannot be exaggerated. Any suggestion of a doubt of its validity is equivalent to a threat to remove one from the most indispensable, perhaps the most indispensable, of all the props on which our picture of the world is supported. And, consequently, it induces a panic terror, or at least an angry outburst of the type of Dr. Johnson's attack on the curbstone, for anger is often a reaction to fear. This is one of the earliest discoveries about the world around us which we made in our infancy, and on it we have based an incalculable amount of the subsequent accretion of knowledge and rules for our guidance, which enable us to hold our own in a dangerous world. The threat of removing it seems to imply plunging us back into the darkness from which we once emerged, at the cost of so much arduous labor. The darkness of the unknown, the unintelligible and the unconscious, the darkness that comprehendeth not. In the next volume, an attempt will be made to reconstruct some parts of the process whereby the infant builds up an intelligible picture of the world, virtually, in fact, creates a world, and painfully achieves full consciousness. It is a far more complex and arduous process than is generally realized, for we adults take so much for granted that we project a large part of our mature understanding into the baby's mind. To us, for instance, it is so self-evident that certain visual patterns represent material objects, things that are permanent, that occupy space, that continue to exist when we cannot see them, that can be moved out in their entirety, that present a different aspect when seen from different points of view, and so on, that we assume that all this is immediately self-evident to the infant. But this cannot be so. It all has to be learnt, and until it has been learnt, the world of sensory experience is unintelligible. Visual and tactile impressions succeed one another without rhyme or reason. But once it has been learnt, every human attainment becomes potentially possible. It is one of our most invaluable possessions. But, as is the way with invaluable possessions, we generally take it for granted, and fail to appreciate its worth until we are threatened with losing it. Around this nucleus, or concomitantly with it, there grows up the wider picture of the world of material objects arranged in time and space. This again appears to the adult as either so self-evident that it must be immediately obvious to the baby, or else if he devotes his developed intelligence to the matter and begins to concern himself with such things as the four-dimensional continuum, as so abstruse that it cannot possibly have anything to do with the infant mind. But the truth is that it is not self-evident to the baby. He has to find out about it. And although, of course, such abstract concepts as those of space and time do not exist for him, he has to build up his own picture of that universal arrangement, which appears to us so obvious that we do not even trouble to think about it. The baby's problem is to understand the visual images of which he becomes aware, which in the first place are mere patches of different colors and tones. By constructing a picture of the world in terms of material objects with intervals between them, and this he can only do by learning first to confirm the evidence of sight by that of touch, and later by himself moving about among the objects of which he becomes aware. His conclusions, of course, are not formally expressed in words. They must consist of a multitude of small empirical discoveries. For instance, that if you stand in one position, an object may be obscured by another, but if you move to the side, it emerges. That a small object near at hand appears larger than a big one at a distance, and so on. These again, of course, are not consciously formulated, but simply learnt as a picture by means of constant repetition of the experiences concerned. Anybody who takes the trouble to work out the mental processes involved in the picture which he makes of the shape and arrangement of a room and its contents in the course of a single glance, having regard to the shapes of the further sides of three-dimensional objects which cannot be seen, the position of each object with relation to the others, etc., will be astounded by the complexities involved in producing all this from a colored pattern on the retina. Nevertheless, the ordering principle of intelligence in the mind of the infant is already capable of collating the disjointed material provided by his eyes and constructing from it a generalized mental picture which enables him, in a year or two, to master such complicated three-dimensional problems as that of getting to the other side of a table by crawling under it, if it is not possible to walk around, and so on. All this is based on the existence in his mind of a coherent system which, for want of a better term, we may call a complex image, the image of the world in space. To what extent this image may be regarded as instinctive, and to what extent it is learnt, is a moot point. It would be necessary to conduct a larger number of experiments in order to determine the matter, but at any rate it is fundamental to a very large part of our mental activity. It must certainly in any case be regarded as archetypal, since unless there were some kind of pre-existent nucleus around which the baby could begin to arrange his original incoherent sensory impressions, it is hard to see how he could so infallibly construct this very complex image long before he has conscious continuity to aid him. We implicitly and confidently rely at all times on the expectation that our sensory experience will invariably conform to this image, or at least to the various laws and relationships which make it up. And when we occasionally meet with an experience which appears anomalous, we are not only surprised, but concerned and distressed as well, and do not rest until we have discovered an acceptable explanation for the anomaly. For the prospect of never again being able to rely on these fundamental presuppositions, on which we base our greatest and our smallest actions, is too appalling to contemplate. The explanations which we are prepared to accept in order to set our minds at rest in face of an anomaly vary, of course, with our individual intelligence and knowledge. The primitive is quite content to put anything of the kind down to witchcraft, and civilized people will accept almost anything on the word of a doctor or a scientist, on the basis of empirical experience. Moreover, all of us are content to dismiss the most outrageous violations of our world picture with complete equanimity, if only we are satisfied that we were properly asleep at the time. Later, when the child becomes aware of his own continuity as the subject of experience, he begins to appreciate the element of time. Here again, the complex image built up in the mind is no more than a sum of a multiplicity of small empirical discoveries. For instance, that two objects cannot occupy the same space at the same time, and that one object can only be in one place at one time. If an object is at one place now, but was earlier somewhere else, then it must have passed through all the intervening space in the interval, and in doing so, it cannot have passed through any part of space occupied by another object. The surprise produced in our minds by the arts of the conjurer is, of course, in almost all cases, the result of his apparent violation of this last law. And until we have become accustomed to the spectacle, it is followed by a feverish search for the explanation. This deeply ingrained picture of the immutable laws governing the relationships of material objects in space and time probably forms the nucleus of our picture of the outer world. To it are added a number of other empirical discoveries, such as the characteristics of the animate and the inanimate, mechanical causation, the possibilities of changes of form in material objects, and so on. Later, it becomes elaborated by abstract ideas, and the picture of the outer world in the mind of an educated and well-informed man includes such purely abstract elements as the laws of science, economics, and even psychology. To return to the child, when consciousness has achieved a certain degree of differentiation and independence, he discovers an alternative mode of experience, which is to abstract images from their space-time conditioned situation in the outer world and do things with them in his imagination. This saves him a great deal of trouble and represents an enormous increase in his mental powers, for now, in order to discover that a round peg will not fit into a square hole, he no longer needs to procure the objects in question and make the experiment in the outer world. He has simply to visualize the two in order to assure himself that they cannot fit. This represents the discovery of the inner world as distinct from the outer, for the direction of abstraction is inwards, that of concretization outwards. It will be remembered that inner and outer are relative terms, and we cannot describe any given mental content as belonging exclusively to either the inner or the outer world. Everything depends on how we look at it and in what we are doing with it. Thus, the imaginary picture of a round peg in a square hole belongs to the inner world when contrasted with the present sensory experience of them. On the other hand, it belongs to the outer world when contrasted with the higher degree abstracts of roundness and squareness, from which it may have been concretized for the purpose of investigating the practical application of a theory. The latter operation is, of course, beyond the mental powers of a young child. To him, any imaginary picture may be described as inner. To the adult, on the other hand, an imaginary picture may be part of the outer world, for we must not forget that both worlds are contained in the mind. Even the most materialistic people constantly imagine things, but their tendency is always to concretize, and their purpose is to put their imagining into practice, or at least to consider whether it is possible to do so. Until the child has consciously perceived the difference between the two worlds, they do not exist for him as two contrasting and alternative modes of experience. He does not, in fact, discriminate between fact and fancy. Only one world exists for him in which anything is possible. For the type of experience which, in the adult, falls into the category of fancy is, of course, familiar to the child from the start. Nothing could be more mistaken than to regard it as a mere second-hand derivation of reality. For the child, however, the two modes of experience are mingled and merge one into the other, the various contents, values, etc., which the adult so carefully segregates from one another, existing side by side without distinction. The differentiation comes gradually, and it is true to say that it is never completed. Throughout life, we continue to confuse the two modes of experience. Everybody has his blind spots, concerning which he is strangely incapable of discriminating between the possible and the impossible, the factual and the imaginary. But intelligent people continue throughout life to enrich the image, applying the distinction between inner and outer to ever wider spheres of experience. It is almost certainly with regard to the scheme of material objects in space and time that all of us first learn to make the distinction. For any discrepancy in that field between the imaginary and the actual sensory experience is obvious, sometimes painfully so. Long after he has learned to discriminate between the imaginary picture and the material presence of such things as round pegs and square holes, however, the child continues to overlook the difference between inner and outer in such matters as the difference between the animate and the inanimate. It is not that he fails to see the difference. He understands it perfectly well, for he knows a real, live animal when he sees one, but he prefers to ignore it, and in his games he is free to do so without incurring any vexatious consequences. When a little girl insists that her doll is a real baby, it is a sufficient indication that she knows quite well that it is not, for otherwise she would not use that significant word real. If the doll began to kick and scream, she would certainly be very alarmed. Officious adults and malicious elder brothers, however, should refrain from pointing this fact out to her, for to do so causes mental distress. She will recognize the distinction of her own accord when she is ready to accept the mental strain that it incurs. For the moment, however, we are not concerned with these later accretions to the complex image representing the outer world, but with that picture of the world as a collection of material objects arranged in space and time, which is its nucleus and its essence. One of the principal contrasts between the two worlds is to be seen in this respect, that whereas the outer world is essentially concerned with space and time, the inner is characteristically free of them. Complete freedom from space and time, of course, implies the elimination of all form, change, and number. In this condition, no conscious experience is possible, and only the ultimate one, which is indeterminate, undifferentiated, unchanging, and unknowable, can exist. Yet this existence, being a negation of all experience, is equivalent to non-existence. This ultimate condition is not attainable by the individual consciousness until its final merging with the universal in death, unless it be in the temporary union with the universal, and the consequent release from the bonds of time, space, and particularity, which is claimed for the beatific vision of the mystics. The inner world, however, is a direction of thought or experience. It is the direction towards the universal aspect of the ultimate one, just as the outer world is the direction away from this, and towards its particular aspect. The nearer the former is approached, the more universal grow the contents of consciousness, and the weaker and more indistinct the bonds of space and time. The awareness of particular identity also grows concomitantly weaker, and there is a danger, as we shall see, that it may be permanently lost. This results in insanity. This consideration leads to a further basic conclusion regarding the nature of the distinction between inner and outer. The inner is the direction of attention towards the universal element in phenomena, the outer towards the particular element. Absolute universality and absolute particularity represent the projection of the concept of the absolute, which is one of the forms under which we attempt to visualize the ultimate one, into this particular polarity. They are unattainable in the phenomenal world, in a pure state, just as absolute good and absolute evil are unattainable. They represent the theoretical concepts of that which is all-embracing and from which all forms proceed, i.e. the universe in its transcendental aspect, on the one hand, and on the other, that which is finally indivisible and therefore contains no parts, being nothing beyond itself, i.e. the atom in the classical sense, the Leibnizian monad, or the principle of absolute individuality, uniqueness, and particularity. Consciousness moves between these two, directing itself first towards one and then the other. The pattern of the contemporary conscious attitude accepts the direction towards the universal only in the sphere of thinking. In other spheres, it is prejudiced against it and sees significance only in the direction towards the particular or concrete. Thus, although the inner world as it manifests itself to a particular consciousness cannot be absolutely free of space and time, their importance in this mode of experience is far less than when consciousness is directed towards the pattern of the outer world. Consequently, many of the laws of outer world logic do not apply to it. In the inner world, for instance, a single identity may exist in two or more exemplars at the same time. Or a single image may embody two states which in the outer world are necessarily separated by an interval of time. The picture of the world as a multiplicity of objects arranged in space and time is based in sensory experience and in a powerful instinct, that of investigation for reassurance, concerned with our use of the senses. Being connected with instinct, it is universal in the species and therefore archetypal. In other words, it is an inherent structure of the mind in accordance with which we are compelled to interpret our experience. We cannot do otherwise. More than that, it is one of the agents which actually make our experience, determining the form in which it reaches consciousness, which is all that we know. Yet it is not the sole manner in which experience can be interpreted, nor the sole agent which forms it, for it has its opposite and counterpart in the alternative mode which in this study is called the inner world, and which other writers have called the inner vision, the creative imagination, the sense of poetry, the world of the eons, the other side, and many other names. In an earlier chapter, I asserted that when we get into chronic mental difficulties, it is due to the fact that our conscious attitude has grown one-sided and intolerant, and is repressing and neglecting categories of experience which are produced by patterns which are inherent in the mind and therefore cannot be eliminated. I further pointed out that since the mind is bounded by its archetypal structures, any such consistent and general attitude adopted by the conscious personality must itself be archetypal. The trouble arises from the overvaluation of one archetypal pattern at the expense of the others. Here we may perhaps discern the basic cause of the troubles from which civilization is suffering today, and which threaten to annihilate it perhaps once and forever. If it is so, it is clear which archetypal pattern we are overvaluing. It is that which sees the world exclusively as material objects arranged in space and time, and regards sensory experience as the sole criterion of reality. This is the root of the scientific outlook. We are now in a position to answer the question posed earlier. We recognized that the scientific method demanded a sensory experience as the indispensable demonstration of the truth of any hypothesis. But we noted that the scientist, as such, has no interest in the sensory experience in itself, as the artist has, but in something which it represents. And we set out to discover what that something was. It is, evidently, an event consisting of the states or situations of material objects in space and time, which the sensory experience fixes. The scientific method has eliminated all other considerations, everything which is non-corporeal. Energy being transformable into mass and being identifiable only in its action on material bodies, can be subsumed under the heading of corporeal, and that which is not bound by space and time is intentionally left out of account. I am not decrying the scientific method in itself, the enormous value of which no reasonable person could deny, but only that attitude which sees in the scientific outlook the sole and exclusive truth. The scientific outlook is a magnificent servant, but servants do not make good masters. It is vitally, urgently necessary that we turn our attention before it is too late to the alternative outlook, namely the inner world pattern, if we are to give this unfamiliar manner of looking at things a chance to find a place in our minds, cluttered and obsessed as they are by the picture of the outer world. It is necessary to make a start by attacking the scientific outlook in order to reduce it to its due place. The sense of inner and outer. It is interesting to note that Jung, in a late work, Antwoord auf Job, or Answer to Job, describes sensation as la fonction de réalité. This term was invented by the psychologist Jagannath. My authority is Jung, evidently in order to designate the mental activity of distinguishing between what is in this study are called the two worlds. When anybody suffers from delusions, for instance, his reality function has broken down, and he is unable to distinguish between fact and fancy. When Jung identifies sensation with this hypothetical function, it is evident that he must be on the track of that role of the senses in identifying the outer world, which is the subject of this chapter. His definition, however, is inadequate and to some extent misleading. I have already quoted the definition of reality which he gives elsewhere. Everything is real which acts, or which has consequences, together with his own illustration demonstrating the reality of a delusion, and it is evident that he cannot understand Janet's term in this sense. In the absence of any explanation, the statement in question is made parenthetically. We can only assume that in equating sensation with la fonction de réalité, he is using the word reality in its normal colloquial sense, i.e. as denoting outer world nature. If this is so, he is at variance with his own assertion in Psychological Types that sensation can be introverted. For there, after stating that introverted sensation is characterized by the predominance of the subjective element of sensation, he goes on, subjective perception differs remarkably from the objective. It is either not found at all in the object, or at most merely suggested by it. This evidently is no fonction de réalité. The confusion appears to arise from two sources. The first is that Jung does not appear to have freed himself completely from the common delusion that material objects somehow exist in a more valid form than anything else. The consequence is that he identifies sensory experience with the functioning of the organs of sense, and presupposes a hypothetical reality which gives rise to it, and in which the other organs themselves participate. But, as we have seen, sensory experience which possesses the full force of conviction normally occurs to everybody in dreams, when the organs of sense are not involved, and it is only after he has woken up that the dreamer convinces himself that the experience lacked the artificial quality of reality which he accords to waking experience alone. In the quality of instinct, we have also seen that the mind inherently possesses its own stock of its sensory images, associated with the special neurosensory mechanisms, which can become conscious spontaneously without the participation of the organs of sense. Hence, sensory experience is by no means limited to the hypothetical outer world object, but is simply a mental function, equivalent to thinking, feeling, or any other. The second cause of confusion of Jung's lack of understanding for the arts. In the section on introverted sensation from which I have quoted, he refers repeatedly to them, but it is evident, both from these passages and from other references to the arts which he makes elsewhere, that his conception of painting, for instance, is confined exclusively to its representational aspect, and even more mistakenly, that he believes in the possibility of a hypothetical, objectively correct manner of reproducing the appearance of nature. This misconception, for which photography is largely responsible, is of course widespread nowadays. This is not the place to go into theories of art, but anybody who has any acquaintance with the subject will appreciate the point that painting, so far as it is representational at all, is largely concerned with the values and nature of visual experience in itself, and not with either the properties of natural objects as they might be determined by scientific measurement, or with the uninstructed layman's idea of what things look like. Music, of course, is almost exclusively concerned with the direct perception and evaluation of sensory experience as such, quite irrespective of either intellectual meaning or of any similarity to natural sounds. When sensory experience is approached from this viewpoint, it is evident that its function in revealing that arrangement of material objects in space and time which forms the nucleus of our picture of the outer world is only one limited aspect of its totality. As we have seen, moreover, other things, such as bank overdrafts, which are wholly independent of sensory experience, are normally accepted as real. Nevertheless, Janet's idea is valuable, for it emphasizes two things. First, that it is by no means so easy as we commonly suppose to distinguish between the inner and outer worlds, in that, as we have seen, the attempt to reach a definition of their natures is beset with difficulties. And secondly, that we constantly do discriminate nonetheless, although not always successfully. As I have already pointed out, anybody whose power of discriminating between them is seriously defective is incapable of coming to terms with civilized life, and has to be certified insane and put under restraint. Janet, therefore, identifying the outer world with reality, and recognizing that there is no simple rule for distinguishing it from the inner, postulated a special mental function to account for our ability to do so. Here lie the two objections to his choice of terminology. First, that he confines reality to the outer world, whereas we have agreed that if the word is to have any meaning in terms of life, it must apply to the inner world also. And secondly, that he presupposes a special mental function equivalent to, e.g., thinking, feeling, or memory, where, according to our theory, the process in question involves no such special function. The differentiation between the two worlds is solely a matter of classification. Individual items of experience being placed in one category or the other, with the aid of the normal mental functions of thinking, feeling, sensation, etc. We do exactly the same in distinguishing between good and evil, beautiful and ugly, abstract and concrete, or any other pair of opposites, and we do not see any necessity for postulating special mental functions for all these. We do it with the aid of complex images, the nuclei of which are instinctive or archetypal. Around these nuclei, in the course of our personal experience, which includes reflection, we build up an intricate system of principles, values, and concrete examples, one or other of which can be relied upon to offer a common factor with any item of experience with which we meet, thus enabling us to classify it as belonging to one group or the other. 2 points emerge from this definition. First, that apart from the archetypal nucleus, there is nothing absolute or universal about our various personal conceptions of the inner and outer worlds. They vary from one individual to another, just as our conceptions of good and evil, beautiful and ugly, vary. It is true that in any given community a number of collective ideas and values are normally embodied in these complex images, which therefore tend to correspond very closely in average people. The difference between the prevailing pictures of any of these polarities obtaining in different communities is, however, striking. What is good to the savage, for instance, may be evil to the civilized man, and even between a Frenchman and a German, an Englishman and an Italian, material differences may be discerned. And even within the same community we frequently find exceptional people who disagree on one point or another. An almost universal standard in the matter of any such distinction is, however, possible. It may be attained by those gifted with the power of insight, which enables them to penetrate to the archetypal nuclei of the various patterns, and to judge according to them without regard for relative or superficial standards, such as the conventions of the community. Thus there is a genuine ethical sense, which judges without regard for legalism or other intellectual principles, for religious precepts or for empty conventions. And there are universal aesthetic standards in which all those who have devoted themselves with perseverance and insight to the study of artistic matters will be found to agree very closely. The second point is embodied in the last consideration. It is that all these complex images are capable of being enriched and perfected. They are enriched by widening their scope, by bringing them progressively into association with wider and more various categories of experience. They are perfected by approximating them as closely as possible to their archetypal nuclei, which constitute the absolute and true element in their composition. It is to be observed that this last process is not to be achieved solely by thinking. The importance of the function of thinking varies in the different polarities. As regards inner and outer, for instance, a good deal can be achieved by it, but the ethical sense is mainly a matter of feeling, and aesthetics of developed sensory values. Neither can be satisfactorily exercised by principle alone or adequately formulated in conceptual terms. It therefore follows that although anybody may have a highly developed working understanding of any of these polarities, he may be unable to offer any adequate definition of it. The definition of good and evil, for instance, is notoriously difficult, yet all of us apply it after a fashion, and some with conspicuous success. When anybody possesses a developed and effective pair of complex images of such a nature, we say that he has a sense of beauty, of good and evil, or whatever it may be, and we speak of the ethical and aesthetic senses. I therefore propose to rename Janet's fonction de réalité, as I understand it, as the sense of inner and outer. It undoubtedly exists in the sense that people habitually make the distinction spontaneously, and some more aptly than others, and this designation obviates both the objectionable implication about the nature of reality and also the unjustifiable assumption that a special mental function is involved. The sense of inner and outer, then, is the means which we normally and habitually employ in discriminating between the outer and the inner world elements in any experience. As explained above, it functions by comparing the concrete case with two complex images, one representing the outer and one the inner world. In the normal contemporary mind, however, the former is rich and highly developed, while the latter is at best nebulous and primitive. Hence, only a negative identification of inner world elements is generally possible. We see that they do not fit into the outer world picture, and are therefore impossible, or at best highly improbable. But with a few superficial exceptions, we do not recognize them positively as belonging to that inner world system. Since, moreover, when we have identified them, we have no adequate system in which we can fit them, as we can in the case of the outer world elements. We cannot make use of them, and nothing remains but to discard them as meaningless and worthless. Thus, in the contemporary situation, the employment of the sense of inner and outer results in a progressive enrichment of the outer world picture, but contributes little or nothing to that of the inner world. Since we know from experience that this inner world has a tiresome habit of projecting itself from the unconscious into outer world situations and masquerading as fact, as seen for instance in the growth of rumors, we are, or should be, always alert to sharpen and intensify our sense of inner and outer in order to arm ourselves against deception. It is from this that our interest in the extraordinary and the improbable arises. It is the criterion of the news value in the sense of the man biting the dog, and the press thrives on its exploitation. When we read of such a thing, we say to ourselves, so things like that can happen. This enriches our outer world picture by drawing our attention to the fact that such things very rarely do happen. It is evident that they are not impossible, but our sense of their extraordinariness and improbability is heightened. In certain cases, moreover, such strange reports do a little to develop our inner world picture, for we may recognize the kind of thing which ought to happen but so rarely does. These fine distinctions can be carried to a high degree of subtlety for which some people have a talent. They are forever playing on the borderline between fact and fancy. Their reminiscences acquire in the retelling every kind of whimsical twist, more or less subtle according to their talent, and the most prosaic events are embellished with fantastic accretions and exaggerations. Yet the results are never obviously impossible. Such a talent undoubtedly constitutes a social asset, and we may be grateful for the pleasure and stimulation which it contributes to life. Yet it has, of course, its dangers, for the success which it earns him may lead the amateur storyteller from the mere choice of words and invention of amusing details which enliven a dull conversation, by way of lead-pulling which may have a malicious trend, to outright imposture. When we come to the study of T.E. Lawrence, we shall find a case in point, in which a talent for the facile invention of such conceits led as far as the falsification of official reports, and the building up of a largely mendacious legend around the figure of their author. What happens in such a case, of course, is that the sense of inner and outer has become too flexible. The subject no longer takes the discrimination between the two worlds with sufficient earnestness, and thus loses his sense of responsibility for his statements. For what we call the sense of responsibility is in large measure equivalent to the sense of inner and outer in this special application, and it is apt to be weak in those who, like Mitty, constitutionally undervalue the outer world. The opposite type has, of course, corresponding vices. The attitude which regards anything as justified if it gets results is a typical one. It is vitally necessary that we should direct our attention to the inner world, but when we do so, we must never for a moment forget that it differs from, and is in many respects diametrically opposed to, the outer. The great danger is always that of interpreting the inner world contents in outer world terms. Thus, the dividing line between the harmless and stimulating use of the talent for imaginative storytelling and its malignant aberrance is the degree of the subject's consciousness of its implications. I recently listened to a commercial traveler in a bar attempting to entertain some colleagues with the tale of a car that had been stolen while containing the dead body of the owner's mother-in-law. He insisted that the story was gospel, and adorned it with all manner of circumstantial detail designed to heighten the factual impression, but his friends, whose sense of inner and outer was no doubt sharpened by their calling, were not satisfied. The dead body in the car, one of them said, "There's something strange about it." He had placed his finger unerringly on the central image around which the remainder of the story, which took some 10 minutes to relate, was built up. There is, in fact, a symbolical inner world element involved, which I am unable to interpret, but do not altogether like, for an entirely different story involving a dead body in a car was going the rounds, both in England and on the continent, in the period immediately preceding the 1939 war, and it referred to Hitler. The narrator in the present case was probably not clearly conscious of the fact that he was lying. He claimed to have checked up on the story, and to know the man to whom it had happened, but would have broken down under cross-examination. I would not for a moment advocate that all conversation should take the form of pedantically accurate pedestrian accounts of fact, for the really gifted narrator can exert a genuinely beneficial, vitalizing effect on his hearers. He is dispensing the waters of life which are only available in the inner world. This is a function which we shall find being exercised in a high degree by Oscar Wilde, who excelled in taking people out of themselves as a conversationalist and entertainer. But Wilde's sense of inner and outer, like Lawrence's, broke down under the strain and became so elastic that it ceased to function adequately, even for his own requirements. The proper sphere for the exercise of the talent for clothing inner world contents in outer world forms is, obviously, the writing of declared fiction, and in this connection it is interesting to find Thurber, in whom, as I have pointed out, the sense of inner and outer is strongly developed, consistently diverting himself and his readers on the borderline between the two worlds. Most of his writing is presented in the form of reminiscence, yet among the elements which bear the stamp of factual exactitude, fantastic details are constantly appearing which tax the reader's credulity, and thus stimulate his sense of inner and outer. To take two examples at random, there is his friend in Ohio named Harvey Lake, concerning whom we are told that when he was only 19, the steering bar of an old electric runabout broke off in his hand, causing the machine to carry him through a fence and into the grounds of the Columbus School for Girls. He developed a fear of automobiles, trains, and every other kind of vehicle that was not pulled by a horse. There is nothing intrinsically impossible in this story, yet it is of the type of a fantasy, and is intended to be recognized as such because the writer is making fun of the popular psychologists. Anybody who is acquainted with the symbolism of fantasies will in fact recognize symbolical elements, but these were almost certainly unknown to the writer. No fantasy is without a hidden meaning, and Thurber, in inventing this little anecdote, is to some extent destroying his own case against the psychologists, because he is unwittingly revealing something about himself. That, however, is beside the point, which is his ability to invent stories on the borderline between fact and fantasy, the recognition of which as possible fantasies is spontaneously made by a well-developed sense of inner and outer. Then there is the sketch of the dog which he himself owned as a boy, most of which is obviously straight reminiscence, but in which we are also told how the family was once awakened by the noise occasioned by the efforts of the dog, which was given to dragging large objects about, to transport a small chest of drawers up the steps of the porch. Thurber, in his confidential way, is leaning toward the reader and murmuring, "There's no harm in my embroidering a little on the facts. It makes the story more amusing, and you are too intelligent to take everything literally." And in fact, provided that it is done in this spirit and within these limits, this kind of tightrope walking between fact and fancy serves a useful purpose, for it sharpens our sense of inner and outer, just as the consideration of difficult ethical problems, such as the conflict between love and duty, sharpens our sense of good and evil, or right and wrong. Recapitulation. Before proceeding, it will be advisable to summarize our conclusions regarding what we call reality, and our manner of distinguishing between the two worlds. 1. All that we know is the contents of our consciousness. If we regard the individual as a subject, nothing exists for him except what he experiences. It is only if we regard him as an object that he is seen to be associated with and influenced by things which he does not consciously experience. But this demands another subject to make the observation. There is, therefore, nothing that we know that is not experienced by some subject. No such thing exists. 2. Nevertheless, we commonly believe and act on the belief that some of the contents of our consciousness represent objects in an outer world which exists independently of the subject, and outside the mind, whereas others do not. The former we designate as real, and the latter as imaginary, or by other equivalent terms. 3. The distinction is valid in that the contents of consciousness can be arranged in various coherent systems or patterns, and have to be so arranged in order that we may understand them. One such pattern is the polarity of the inner and outer systems or complex images, which are opposed in nature. By learning to classify the items of experience under these two headings, we are enabled to understand and hence to come to terms with them. A mistake in classification results in confusion, and may lead to a false attitude and hence to undesirable consequences. E.g., if I dream that I am a king, I must beware of classifying this experience in the outer world category, in which it would have a certain definite significance which is incompatible in my case with the remainder of the pattern. In the inner world category, on the other hand, it has a totally different significance, the understanding of which is helpful to me in adjusting myself to the influences affecting me from the inner world. 4. We are at liberty to define the terms reality and existence as we please, and there is no logical objection to anybody's saying that he intends them to mean conformity with what in this study is called the outer world. The words, however, as colloquially used, do not only denote an intellectual concept, but also an attitude in which feeling values, which are unaffected by logical conclusions, play an important part. This attitude takes the form of a conviction that that which exists or is real is important and significant, and that we must take account of it. The non-existent and unreal, on the other hand, lack importance and significance and can be ignored. Such an arbitrary use of the terms, therefore, is inadvisable, because it implies that everything which does not belong to the outer world system is unimportant. 5. We have adduced evidence to show, a. that outer world experience, which we commonly regard as universal and objective, also contains elements which are peculiar to the individual subject, and b. that inner world experience, commonly regarded as purely subjective and individual, contains universal elements which are the same for all individual subjects. There are, therefore, no grounds for discriminating between the two on this score. A difference undoubtedly exists, but it must be based on other factors. 6. It is this supposed exclusive objectivity and universality of the outer world category of experience that gives rise to the notion of an independent, real outer world which is represented by them, while no such reality is deemed to be behind those experiences which do not fit into this category, i.e., those of the inner world. Profounder thinkers, however, have always recognized that no such differentiation is justified. If experience represents anything beyond itself, i.e., anything unknown to the subject, there are no grounds for attributing such a background to one form of experience and not to another, e.g., to waking life and not to a dream. 7. This position leads to the notion of the universal subject which lies behind and beyond the personal subject and is therefore unknowable. The subject perceives through the multitude of individual subjects, according to the particular type of consciousness available to each of them, but the experiences of each individual subject are segregated from those of the remainder by the barrier of the particular individual viewpoint. Each individual subject becomes an individual object when seen from the viewpoint of another individual subject, but the universal subject can never be an object and is therefore unknowable. 8. The hypothetical reality lying beyond all experience of any nature may be regarded as what Kant called the thing in itself, or the universal object, which, like the universal subject, is unknowable to the individual subject. 9. Subject and object are obverse and reverse of the universal one, which lies behind all experience and existence, containing all things within itself in a potential form, and each of these two aspects of it exists only as the counterpart of the other. All experience, whatever its form, and irrespective of whether it is true or untrue, or whether universal or confined to a single individual consciousness, is equally an aspect of the object as perceived by the subject, and none enjoys a greater degree of validity or of reality in the absolute sense than any other. In this context, it is inadmissible to discriminate between truth and reality on the one hand, and illusion or figment on the other. All that we can say is that certain items of experience are found to conform to familiar coherent patterns, united and determined by logical principles, sensory experience, or whatever it may be, while others are not. 10. Those items of experience which can be fitted into a pattern are readily understood, and are therefore regarded as important, valuable, and real, whereas those which do not, being incomprehensible, are ordinarily overlooked or discarded as meaningless, worthless, and unreal. The patterns in question, however, are built up by each individual in the course of personal experience, and his inability to comprehend certain classes of experience may well be due simply to the fact that he has failed to equip himself with a mental pattern into which they fit. 11. The contemporary Western outlook has been built up on the basis of a pattern determined by concentration on the rational, the objective, and certain aspects of sensory experience. It lacks a pattern capable of assimilating material which falls outside these categories, and is consequently prejudiced against such material. The scientific outlook is the epitome of this pattern, and, although of great value in itself, is threatening to produce a dangerous psychic disequilibrium through its one-sidedness, and its neglect and depreciation of material which is incompatible with it. 12. Quite apart from the scientific outlook, however, no amount of theorizing can eliminate our universal and spontaneous conviction of the superior reliability of sensory experience as a revelation of reality, i.e. of that which is important, and, we imagine, exists in its own right, irrespective of our mental processes. The explanation of this is the importance of sensory experience in the instinctive patterns which are universal in the species, and act on every individual with intense and compulsive power. 13. The most important instinct from this point of view is that which impels the individual to resort to sensory investigation in order to remove doubt regarding the nature of anything conspicuous but not immediately recognizable. In the human species, the two senses particularly concerned are those of sight and touch, and on the mutually confirmatory evidence of these two is based the archetypal picture of material objects, which is basic to all our thought. 14. A further development of this picture is that of the world as an arrangement of material objects in space and time, disposed round the person of the subject in the present moment of consciousness. This picture is so fundamental to our thinking that it is almost impossible for us to visualize the world in any other form, although mathematicians are concerned to a considerable extent in constructing imaginary worlds based on other premises. 15. So inextricably is our outlook bound up with this picture, and so intimately do all the ideas on which we base our understanding of the world, and the rules by which we guide our conduct depend on it, that in the ordinary man any questioning of its validity produces a reaction of fear, often followed by an indignant protest. Only those who have accustomed themselves to speculative thought and its implications are able to view with equanimity the prospect of abandoning this picture. 16. Thus, that element in sensory experience which is basic to our picture of the outer world, and on which the whole system of science rests, is solely the aspect of the senses which is connected with the archetypal picture of the world as an arrangement of material objects in space and time. The pure study of sensory material, according to its own intrinsic nature and values, is aesthetics, and with this subject science is not concerned. It partakes indeed rather of the nature of the inner than of the outer world, and is regarded by most people as of small importance. 17. Although the picture of the world as an arrangement of material objects in space and time provides the archetypal nucleus around which our picture of the outer world is constructed, a great deal is built onto it by each individual in the course of his personal mental development. The additions vary from one individual to another, although in any community the majority of individuals accept the prevalent collective picture ready-made, and their pictures of the outer world therefore coincide to a considerable degree. The pictures of the outer world in the minds of a savage and of a civilized man, however, differ very considerably. 18. The correct classification of our experience in the inner and outer world categories is of the greatest importance to us, and in our normal daily lives we are very frequently called upon to discriminate on the best evidence available between the two. We have to decide what is practicable, what is plausible, what possible, and what the reverse. Inner world elements which are not valid in the outer world are very apt to slip into our estimations, and it is most necessary for us to guard against this danger. This process of discrimination may be described as the application of a sense of inner and outer, which is precisely on a par with the senses of good and evil, or of beauty and ugliness. The process, in fact, consists in the comparison of the image in question with the two pre-existent complex images of the inner and outer worlds, which have been built up in the mind, and the richness and scope of which varies from one individual to another. 19. The general tendency in the contemporary Western world is for the outer world image to be highly developed, whereas that of the inner world is poor and nebulous. Outer world elements, therefore, are positively identified, whereas those of the inner world are only recognized negatively, by reason of their irreconcilability with the outer world picture. Once they have been identified, moreover, no use can be made of them, since we lack any comprehensive scheme into which they can be fitted. 20. Certain individuals of the Walter Mitty type are constitutionally and by habit inclined to undervalue the outer world, living by preference in the inner. If such people possess a developed inner world picture, they are able to make sense of their experience and may succeed in becoming creative. This, however, is seldom the case, for, in common with everybody nowadays, they are indoctrinated with the belief in the exclusive reality of the outer world, and are taught that a great deal about its laws and workings, whereas the interpretation of the inner world, which is so much more important for them, is left to their own unaided abilities, which may not be considerable. Thus they find themselves in the position of a savage left in charge of a powerhouse, for the inner world contains great forces. Inevitably, they interpret their inner world experiences in outer world terms, and seek to apply them in this form to their environment. In consequence of the unsuitability of raw inner world material to the totally different nature of the outer world, the middies, to begin with, meet with failure and humiliation, whereupon they either draw from the outer world in disgust, living in the seclusion of their secret lives, in which case such abilities as they may have are generally lost to the world, or else they persevere until they have found means of forcing their inner world conceptions on the outer world, irrespective of the consequences. In the latter case, they become fanatics and doctrinaires, and may do great harm. The elucidation of the nature and laws of the inner world, in order to bring the collective picture of it into something approaching parity with that of the outer world, is therefore a matter of urgent necessity.